myself. My name is Malinda Maynor Lowery. I'm the director of the Southern Oral History Program, and so happy to see all of you so early in the morning. Thank you for being here. We're going to start out with a few words from Cliff Kuhn and Luann Jones, who are the folks who are responsible for us being here, and also oral historians and alumni of Southern Oral History Program.
Good morning. I'm Cliff Kuhn. I'm the Executive Director of the Oral History Association, which is the national professional organization in the field. I'm delighted to see people from lots of different vantage points, from community colleges, from high schools, undergraduates, and scholars and public historians here, because that's who we are. We are a broad tent. I encourage you to do three things. I'll make my remarks brief. Go to our website, oralhistory.org. Become a member if you can. We have student rates. And if you're in the vicinity, attend our national conference, which will be in Madison, Wisconsin this year. I know there's somebody from Iowa who is with the hailing distance of Madison, and I encourage you all to dive in and learn more and interact with our organization, and I welcome all of you to Atlanta. We will have a booth with other publications in the exhibit hall, and pamphlets and newsletters and other publications, and so I encourage you to come by there. Thank you and welcome. Have fun today.
And just briefly, I'm Luann Jones. I'm a historian with the National Park Service, and we're germane to this event. I'm a member of the Public History Committee of the Organization of American Historians. This is the fourth year that we have sponsored an oral history workshop at our annual meetings, and we always like to feature one of the programs from the host region. So this year, it's just a great pleasure to be able to welcome the Southern Oral History Program. I think this is the first year of the four that the workshop sold out. So you're in for a great treat, and I think you know that. And a special pleasure because Cliff and I are alums of the Southern Oral History Program, which is just celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. So congratulations to the SOHP, and thank you all very much for being part of this.
Thank you to Luann and Cliff, and Luann just said just about everything that we'll say about SOHP. But I first wanted to ask our team to introduce themselves. You'll learn more about us throughout the morning, but you guys would just
Can you all hear us in the back? Is the sound okay? Okay. I'm Rachel Seidman. I am the Associate Director of the Southern Oral History Program. I'm the one you got an email from probably. Thank you to those of you who responded, and let us know what you're interested in so that we can tailor this a little bit to your needs. And we'll ask you throughout to keep letting us know what questions you have. Thank you for being here.
I'm J.C. Voss. I'm the coordinator of collections for the Southern Oral History Program.
And I'm Seth Kotch. I was for 5 years the digital projects director of the program.
And Seth is now an assistant professor American Studies at UNC. I'm also an associate professor of history at UNC. And so Rachel is an adjunct faculty member in the history department at UNC. So we have multiple roles as we work with oral history. I wanted to just say a few words about what SOHP is, what we do, and that will just sort of introduce you to our assumptions and working perspective on oral history. What we do is research, of course, like all of you. We're all here because we have a mutual interest in using oral history as a research method and practice. But the way we do research is not necessarily what you'd expect. It's not an activity that's conducted by an individual in an isolated fashion who publishes his or her findings for an academic audience. We do that kind of research, but what we spend the majority of our time doing is defining research as a collaborative enterprise with a purpose to serve the needs of the public in a variety of ways. And we've been doing this now for 40 years. Our founding director, Jacqueline Dowd Hall, was president of the Organization of American Historians back in the, early 2000s? Early 2004-ish, about 10 years ago, she was president of OAH, and we are just carrying on, as I say, the tune that she wrote, we're singing in the same key. But her work and our work as a team begins with this core principle that learning about the past from the people who lived it is of inherent value to the public, and this is why our collaboration with Luann and public history is so important. That learning about the past is of inherent value to a public who wants to know the origins of the challenges and possibilities that our society faces. Because history always gives you the answer to the question, why? You have to know why we're in this situation. We look back to the past first to begin to explain. Oral history also helps you answer the question, how? How do we fix it? And we'll be listening to lots of different examples and talking about different examples of things about today. Luann mentioned our 40th anniversary, which is this year, and we had a big celebration last Friday, which was planned by these fantastic people, particularly JC, who did a ton of work to bring together the right voices to sort of help the audience understand what, not just the value of doing oral history for history's sake or for the sake of historians, but for what it means for the kind of collaborative relationships with the public that I was just trying to describe. One of our interviewees that was present at that event said that listening to life history, someone's life experiences, prepares you to empathize with that person's point of view. And I just can't think of a better way to describe what oral history does and what SOHP does. When you listen, you can empathize in a way that reading a person's words, whether it was a manuscript or a memoir or a different type of primary source, doesn't allow you to empathize. And if you've had this experience already, then that's probably what draws you to oral history. If you're very new to oral history, you'll quickly discover that this is like the most exciting thing about it. So we, at SOHP, work on multiple things, and you'll learn about them, most of them today, to teach students, to engage the public, in particular to engage people who lived history, and to preserve their knowledge for future generations, and to create opportunities for people inside and outside the academy to activate that knowledge in ways that are useful to them. So Rachel and I just wanted to ask you all, this is going to be a very kind of interactive workshop. In other words, we don't like talking as much as we like listening. That's why we're oral historians, right? We like listening. So we first wanted to know from you guys, what is oral history? You want to answer the question, what is not oral history?
Journalism.
Journalism is not oral history.
I think that oral history is, among other things, it's the perceptions and the experience of the movers and shakers in a society who may or may not get the credit for those things that are primarily interested in credit. It's not the official records, it's not the people in Washington, it's not the people who control elite universities, it's people who actually move them.
So the people who made change, who journalists wouldn't necessarily find, but folks who are historians could find. What else? What else informs oral history?
It can also give us access to daily life in a way that doesn't usually get recorded.
Do you have an example? What kind of daily life?
I studied everyday life. I'm new to this. I'm not actually an oral historian, I'm an archival historian.
Yeah.
So in the archives, it's very hard to study everyday life, but it's wonderful and fun when you can try to get at what people were doing in the past. But oral history seems to provide an opportunity to ask them about their breakfast and what they did in the middle of the day, and think questions that aren't usually recorded in archival documents.
What else?
Probably perspective. I think, for example, I have a number of students in my classes who are veterans of the war in Iran, in Iraq or Afghanistan. And these are young people, and I look at them, and they have the stories. They can tell you the experiences, and they've talked about it. And I don't understand what they have gone through, but I hear their words and their so it's really about perspective. I mean, I could write as a third-party person about what transpired, but, you know, they lived it. And that's what makes oral history, I mean, you can get very passionate about it. I'm sure I'm speaking to the choir, but you can get passionate about it because you want to know what it was about, what an incident was about, what was their feeling, what was their perspective. I mean, this is what is so critical, and it can't be lost. It can't be lost. You look at the World War II veterans that are still alive. Their stories are going to die with them. And that can't happen. I mean, this is critical that we save these stories.
So one of the things that you've all said, I think that's in common, is that oral history provides access to knowledge that we can't get typically in written sources. If these veterans were going to write down their stories, then it would become a written source.
Right.
And as an archival historian, or that's how I began my work too, as a social historian, you know, we look to those types of sources as being authoritative in a different kind of way. And then when you begin to access people's stories as they're told orally, there's a new level of knowledge that arises and that we can use as history. Do you want to talk a little bit about sort of the practice of oral history is different from kind of archival history?
Yeah, so one of the things that's come up in a couple of the comments is about the creation of oral history is a different kind of process than archival research. So one of the things that we talk about a lot is that every oral history is a co-creation and between the interviewer and the interviewee. So if you look at this picture of an interviewer and an interviewee, the story that emerges from their interaction is going to be similar in many ways, but also different than the story that might emerge if I interviewed the same person, because my experiences would be different. I would catch different tones in the story because the gender dynamics would be different. So every oral history that emerges from an interaction is unique in that way. And it's similar in some ways from an archival historian's perspective, because every historian will interpret a source differently. But the transcript that emerges or the recording that emerges will actually be different based on who's doing that interview. So that's one really powerful and complicated issue of oral history that we talk about.
It makes the interviewer's role in telling the story much more prominent than if, say, those veterans were writing down their own stories or speaking aloud without being interviewed. That's what we call maybe memoir, for example, or autobiography, and not particularly oral history. Oral history is a co-creation, what would I say? It's a co-creation between the interviewer and the interviewer.
One thing that we talk about when we're doing trainings with oral historians is that there are different approaches to oral history, and you can choose between them, and you can meld them, in fact. But basically, people talk about two different types, one being a life history and one being a topical oral history. So if someone participated, for instance, in a major strike in a North Carolina textile mill, some oral historians would really focus their interview on the sort of daily events of that strike and where that person was and how they experienced that and who they were talking to. And other oral historians would do a life history where they start at the beginning of that person's life and maybe even are asking them about their grandparents and their parents and their early childhood experiences all the way up to and including the strike, and then also reflecting back on the strike from their vantage point today. And at the SOHP we have both, but because we're building an archive that will last for generations, all of these oral histories are archived at the Southern Historical Collection at UNC and are available to people around the world and will be forever. We tend to focus on life histories because For one thing, we believe that you can't really understand how a person reacts to a particular event without understanding how they got there, where they're coming from. If their grandparents were mill owners versus mill workers, that's going to affect their, their relationship to that strike. But also because sometimes, it turns out that that person was in a marching band in high school, and we're not particularly interested in that. But 40 years from now, a historian might come along and she's writing a history of marching bands, and that turns out to be the most important piece of that interview for her. So because, or some piece of their daily life. So because we think in terms of not just interpreting these research questions that we have, but also because we're building this archive for all time, that shapes the kinds of questions that we ask and how we come at these interviews. But everyone comes to their interviews with different needs and desires and audiences in mind, and that shapes the kinds of questions you ask.
I wanted to ask JC and Seth to talk a little bit about why, again, the all important question, why we do what we do. These are the very experienced practitioners of oral history.
We wanted to talk for a minute about why we do it, but we thought too that we would begin by asking you why we do it. But first I wanted to mention something that just came to mind listening to Malinda and Rachel, which is that I think in choosing to do oral history, we're not choosing to do oral history instead of normal history, right? We're choosing to do oral history as another layer of understanding the lived experiences of the people who are populating a history that we are developing with traditional archival research and all kinds of the sort of so-called normal research methods that we learned in graduate school or are learning in graduate school, etc. So oral history is not done to the exclusion of other styles of history. It's done in a way that's supposed to really put the human voices at the middle of an equally well fleshed out manuscript. So your footnotes will be just as long as everything else in the oral history. You just might actually be able to listen instead of just read. So why, you told us a lot already in your responses today and over email about why you're interested in doing oral history, and certainly there's the sort of imperative of collecting dating voices, and there's the interest in unearthing details of people's daily lives that are often lost because the people that oral historians speak to are often people with no expectation of posterity. Why are you interested in doing oral history? Yeah.
I have a totally different reason. I teach in high school, and so I do oral history so my students don't get bored with history. And I have students, as soon as we get to a time period where there are people who might still be alive, so usually World War II and Depression, they part of their grade for that quarter or whatever is interviewing someone who stayed at home or someone who fought, and then we've gone up to like Vietnam, and then with my History Honor Society, we do the South Carolina Veterans Project, which is interviewing veterans to send to the National Archives. So it keeps them, they can read about it in the books and that kind of stuff, and I'm a scintillating lecturer, but still, when they go out and actually talk to people and then they come back and like, it's just like it's said, like it really was like that, and I'm like, well, yeah. So, but it does, it makes a difference, and it keeps them more connected to, to the history from that point on. So that's why I do it.
So I mean, you're turning your students into practitioners in a way that just engaging with reading a textbook, or even to some degree manuscript research, can't quite convey the sort of connection to the past.
Right. And oddly enough, I taught my son, and he is now interning at the National World War II Museum, going through oral histories of Pacific vets and helping to transcribe and decide what's going to be in displays and stuff. So it's a fun thing.
Yeah, that's great. That.
I was just going to say I've done the same thing on the college level and had students interview, picking a particular moment in time, whether it was the assassination of Kennedy or whatever. And two things have happened. Number one, history comes alive for them because I try to teach my survey students history is about people. And so not only do they learn something that's specifically about the period, they become very close to their interviewee. It's just, it makes history so real for them. And I think that it's a wonderful way to connect, sort of distant events with real people.
And building a personal relationship with the past.
Right.
I'm still working
working this out, I have a twofold reason. I'm studying healthcare activists and pre-clinic activists in the 60s and 70s. There's two parts. One is they weren't really fond of keeping records.
Right.
A lot of the stuff that you were discussing isn't going to be recorded. But even beyond that, it's this archive versus oral history thing. Most of what's going to be in the archive is the end of the process. Not all of the lively, we had these thoughts, we worked this out. It's the codification. And so giving the oral histories brings the whole process to life. And if you really want to figure out, what people really were trying, there's nothing,
Yeah, and your project raises the sort of interesting ethical question of what to do when you're talking to people about things that they did that may not have been entirely on the right side of the law that they were doing. We can talk about it, but yeah, was there one more? Yeah. Yeah.
I'm working with a corporation, and by very nature, most of what's archived is of the elites and the corporate message. So, in taking interviews of the people that made that corporate message come alive,
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing, and I think what I believe is we're sort of participating in an intervention. And this isn't a surprising or a radical intervention at this point, because it's sort of been going on for quite a while. But the basic intervention is that history is about people, and that we should listen to people describe their own stories and take them seriously. In addition to, or in the context of the sort of power of decision makers and people who are shaping messages and making decisions. And you can do an oral history with Bill Clinton. We're very proud of the one that we had in our collection when he was a congressman, having lost his first congressional race, talking about wearing blue shirts as the Rhodes Scholar Oxford professor in rural Arkansas. But the idea is that you're not allowing the narrative to be shaped quite so much by elites, even if you're talking to the elites themselves. So I suppose we have one of our interviewees who had a comment herself on this subject.
Why is it that you said you're so willing to give up your time in interviews this way?
It's not giving up time. There is no gift at my stage in life, but it is of giving innermost thoughts, many of which I have never tried to put in words to any other person, because it seems to me the times which always to older people and maybe always are out of joint. But I think the spread of alienation and the attitude of so many people, there is no hope. These students at Delta State asked me, do you think the United States is done? Well, that if a person can study the life of another person and see that with purpose, with attention to each step and direct towards the next step, and by seizing opportunities and concentration can accomplish a great deal, maybe it will be worth taking up the time and people interview and my effort to articulate rather vague thoughts. So,
You seem to have your philosophy fairly outlined.
well, I tell you, the person at 80
So, with all the comments you've all been giving and what we talked about so far, I think we've established a lot of ways, or a lot of reasons why we actually do it, but I just wanted to emphasize a few more. So the SOHP's unofficial motto for a long time now has been, you don't have to be famous for your life to be history. And I just want to reinforce how, like a lot of you have been bringing up, that oral history really allows us to get to the voices of people who do matter and who have made a huge impact on history, but who haven't often been included. So that's been something that's been guiding our work for a very long time. And you all spoke about how you can use oral history to engage students and how it can really help bring history to life because it allows you to really see this emotional side of things. Hearing somebody's voice is much different than just reading the transcript. I think you can see just with this example, if you were only to read the this quote, it would be kind of funny and you would kind of get it, but when you actually hear it, you hear this woman's voice and just how the interaction is going, it adds so much more and it really brings it to life in this really special way that I'm not sure any other sort of research can really do.
It kind of raises sort of a theoretical question, but also one that's kind of interesting to contemplate, which is what is the interview actually? Is it the time that you sat down together with that person? Is it after you've turned off the recording and have transcribed the interview and you have it on paper? Is it the recording itself? Or is it some combination of all those things? This may not affect your daily practice as oral historians, but it's something I think that is fun to talk about, or at least to challenge our ideas and shapes our ideas about what we do with the oral history after we've conducted the interview.
And we'll talk more about some of these issues later. So you also mentioned how it really reveals a lot of new connections between people and events and organizations that weren't often revealed otherwise, and it adds this rich layer to the context that you're already establishing. But something that I recently think I was thinking more about was how doing oral histories actually impacts interviewees. So at our 40th anniversary, we brought back one of our illustrious interviewees to speak at the event. It was Howard Lee. He was the first African-American mayor of Chapel Hill. And he was basically explaining how the first time he had ever been interviewed for one of our oral history projects really was one of the first times he had ever confronted a lot of issues in his past. And he said it was kind of, part of it was a little bit painful, but it really prompted a lot of introspection, and it was extremely cathartic, and it seemed like it was a really empowering moment for him. Or it prompted, a lot of introspection. It wasn't just a single moment, but it gave him this opportunity to rethink some things and just kind of reflect on where he had been and where he was going in this way that no other, like nothing else in his life had ever prompted him to do before. And that to me was a huge, like a benefit of oral history that I didn't even know really existed until we heard that from him.
Well, Rachel will give us a quick overview of kind of some goals today, but I think part of this discussion is summing up that for SOHP, and I think for most people who practice oral history, we focus a lot on getting to the interview, and we'll talk this morning about getting to do interviews and how we do that, but it's really a reflective process that is an iterative process that you engage in again and again and again as you're trying to gather historical knowledge. It's not just about acquiring pieces of information, but it's about really engaging with your interviewee, with yourself, with the public, with your students, about what history means and what it means to us.
And actually acquiring information in oral history can be the most difficult
Yeah.
and frustrating thing to try to do, because if you're sitting down with someone just to try to get a catalog of their early life, I suppose it's very easy to kind of shut an interview down by forefronting the fact that there's lots of things that people might not remember, especially if we're talking to elders like World War II veterans, for example. And finding ways to sort of acknowledge that there are going to be holes in their memory while still making sure that we appreciate the value of the things they do remember, or the way in which they do or don't remember other things, can all be very significant.
So you all have an agenda in front of you, and you get a basic sense of the outline of the day. I just wanted to talk a little bit briefly about how that's going to unfold and the goals. Are you missing?
More than those, none of us back here have them.
Do you have the whole packet and just not the agenda?
No, they cover.
We're missing a few.
That is not fun. You just shift through records.
You guys got what you need?
I can try that.
All right, so, hi, good morning. I'm going to give you what I just heard led me to think that we should also perhaps be very careful with the psychological impact on the interviewee. When I heard you say something about cathartic, it sounds like it's a good thing, but it also might be a bad thing.
Yes.
And so should we, in some ways, be trained to deal with breakdowns and things?
Well,
we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that when we get around to cover. All of these sort of ethical issues come up constantly throughout the process, and I'm glad that you're asked. So keep asking those kinds of questions, because when we have a chance to sort of discuss towards the end of the workshop what all this means, that's definitely the kind of thing we want to incorporate. It's a huge issue.
So one of the things I was going to say is that you can probably tell for us part of the fun of working at SOHP is that we get to talk about these ethical and philosophical and practical and pragmatic problems and questions about doing oral history all the time with each other, but and with our students and with the workshops that we run. But I know for a lot of you, you're doing oral history sort of on your own in settings where you don't have a lot of people to talk to about it. And so part of the goal of this workshop is to give you a chance to talk through some of these complicated issues, ethical issues, practical issues, philosophical issues. So we're going to go through a lot of the practicalities of how you do this, but there will also be time for these kinds of questions to come up throughout the day. Basically, we've broken the day down into how you kind of define an oral history project and do the research behind it, how you actually do the interview itself, and then the practicalities of archiving and documenting and sharing your work with the public. We will have sort of small group discussions. I think now that we see we're sitting at tables, we'll just have you talk with your table when the time comes. And we will have time set aside for these kinds of complicated ethical questions that arise too. So be sure to ask us questions as they come in your head, or jot them down to save for what seems like the right moment. And if anything doesn't get answered, you all have my email, I think now, and be sure to let us know if there are things that came up for you that we didn't get to address by the end of the time.
Well, we also can't say enough about the role of collaboration in defining a research project. So many of you, we all have worked on our own investigating oral history as a topic, but the great benefit of a workshop like this is that you can come together and discuss these complicated issues, or sometimes not so complicated issues, like how do I pay for a digital recorder, with colleagues. And so we're incredibly fortunate to be able to work together. This is a photograph of one of our graduate students, and doing a kind of presentation, but these types of presentations are where collaborative work comes out. He's presenting about his own research, but he's getting feedback from everybody else at the table, which is something that archival historians do as well, of course, at conferences like this. But when you're constantly engaged in co-creating history and a historical narrative, it means that collaboration is built into defining your project and to planning it. So we have a couple of things that we keep in mind when we're planning and defining our projects. Methods, questions, and scope in particular. So as with any type of historical inquiry, you want to draw some boundaries around it, right? Temporal boundaries, place-based boundaries, population boundaries. Maybe you're interested in a particular event and how that played out over time. And we use those same types of boundaries when we're thinking about oral history as well. But we also use oral history, as Seth said, to add significant types of knowledge and significant ways of engaging with what the past means, the significance of the past, to the archival record that we are also examining. We think about finding out about the worlds people live in, as well as the communities that they intersect with, that their identities might intersect with as we prepare a project. Typically, we all each have different experiences about defining research projects, but mine have typically started with, this is a group of people I want to interview because they have something in common. In my case, it's mostly been members of my own community, the Lumbee Indian community in North Carolina. And so I'm like, well, okay, I'm interested in civil school desegregation, or I'm interested in sharecropping, or I'm interested in food, or I'm interested in a variety of things, and I'm going to interview these folks who maybe, some of them I know personally, but a lot of them I don't. I'm just connected to them through our larger tribal society, right? We all are part of communities in that same way, and then we also try to bring in voices to these projects that belong to other types of communities. And so as you're planning, defining the project, you want to think about who are your interviewees and how do their identities intersect with each other? They overlap, or maybe they diverge in important ways. And that's part of the reflection that is important to do as you're gathering your thoughts about what questions to ask, about who else to interview, and about what kind of archival research that you need to do. One of the things that Rachel said as we were planning this workshop is that curiosity is the best preparation. And so, like we like to listen more than we like to talk, and that's something that's also really great to keep in mind if you're doing an oral history. Historians, especially if you're a teacher, whether it's high school or college or any other setting, you wind up talking all the time because people think that learning is about being told information, when in our practice, learning is about listening primarily to information that is imparted to you and that gives over control to someone else. And so as you're defining, again, those boundaries of your research project, you have to think about the fact that in oral history, you don't have control, particularly, over what kind of information the folks you're interested in talking to are going to give you. And so that means the boundaries that you think, like, I'm going to do a project about Lumbee food. Well, it's probably going to turn into a project about Lumbee labor. It's going to turn into a project about land loss. It's going to turn into a project about gender. It's going to turn into a project about all these other things. Because if somebody's not particularly interested in talking about food that day, but I've selected them, I've asked them to share their story with me because they have a body of knowledge about food, for example, or food waste. But they might want to talk about something else. And then undoubtedly, I might go back to them again, but then I might say, wait a minute, what they said in this particular part of the interview, as JC pointed out, is going to transform my project. So again, the defining of the project is something that is an ongoing process, and it will influence the outcomes of the project too, which we'll talk more about later.
I just wanted to add another example that was interesting in terms of defining a project and picking who to interview. We've been doing a very large program or project on we call it the Long Women's Movement in the American South. And the narrative of the feminist movement, the second wave feminist movement in the 60s and 70s has really been told as though everything happened in the Northeast or maybe in Chicago and some in California, but really very little. The assumption has been that it really had no impact in the South. There was no feminist movement in the South, and no one's really talked about it. So we wanted to explore that and find out what did happen, who was involved. And but instead of, this is one of those, it's kind of funny in a way. Part of the reason we started in Knoxville, Tennessee, was because one of our graduate students was from that area. And she had contacts there, and she knew that there was, that there were women's health clinics and things, and so she knew that there was a long history of feminist activism. But it was also because she had gatekeepers that she knew that she could get to, and they would help open up the context. So it wasn't, so defining your project is often about as much of, it's a combination of the questions you have, your research questions, and the boundaries, the practical matter of how you're going to get access to people who understand these things.
Yeah,
but
start local as well as global, as well as your historiographic inquiry, the temporal and other boundaries of the project.
And the other thing about the way we went about that project was we did not interview only people who said, yes, in 1960 I was a feminist, or 1970 I was a feminist. We really opened it up to people who were active in all different kinds of movements, or who might have even said, no, I really didn't consider myself a feminist, but I was doing this other work about coal mines, And I, did realize that the impact on women was different than the impact on men, and I started organizing women. So now when I look back at it, I think, actually I was kind of doing women's movement work, thinking about how broadly you define your pool of people can really have an impact on what you learn, because we really learned that a lot of women who did not see themselves as feminists in the 60s or 70s now look back and think, well, yeah, clearly the women's movement was really affecting me in these ways. And so we see how it played out in the South in ways that we might not have noticed if we only went looking for, people who were active in feminist organizations.
Who identified themselves that way. That's a great example of how overlapping or divergent identities, if you are able to reflect on that and ask appropriate questions about what's missing, put yourself in the position of someone who is living, working in that time and place, and say, how would I have thought about my work? It enables you to ask questions that historians, frankly, working only in print sources are really not able to ask because of the limitation of their sources and the way those sources talk about these kinds of issues or don't talk about them at all.
So once you've picked, that wasn't a question. Once you've picked your topic and you've started defining your pool of people, we talked about curiosity is the best preparation, but you really do archival research. You do go and read as much as you can about this area, about these particular people, about this movement. You do want to have that historiographical information in your head, and you want to not be asking people the kind of very basic factual questions that you can get from newspapers of that time or those things. But
like, what date was the Tet Offensive? Like, the
right,
interviewee doesn't want to be asked that.
Yeah.
They might want to be, even though you know how old they are, it might help you to ask how old they are. So there's certain kinds of historical facts you got to have kind of on the ground before you go in, and then other things.
Yeah, I can add that process of demonstrating that you've done some work around your interview with this person, just the emotional and the psychological, if that's the right word, benefit of how you demonstrate to the interviewee that you have taken their story seriously and that you're here with serious questions and that you understand to the extent that you can the context that their life took place in, goes a long way in those early questions to demonstrate to them that you're here, you're serious, and you really want to learn from them. Showing up unprepared is a good way to tank an interview, right? So I think there's a real emotional as well as an intellectual reason to do that legwork before you go and sit down with somebody.
You'll see later we're going to look at an interview that was done by some undergraduates at UNC where they were so tied to the research that they had done that also kind of tanked the interview. So you'll see that it can be a tricky question about how you use the research that you've done. But
remember that principle that curiosity is the best preparation. Curiosity will prepare you for the archival work you need to do ahead of time. Equal curiosity will prepare you for the interview itself.
Okay.
Yeah, why don't we talk about finding some interviews?
I think Rachel brought up a lot of good examples of sort of gatekeeper types of figures where you can get a lot of information from them. And so I just wanted to speak more about finding your interviewees and then actually contacting them. So one thing to consider is once you've pinpointed a person that you want to interview is have they already been interviewed? If that's the case, you really need to consider if it would be worth your time to actually go and do another interview. If a lot of time has passed between the first interview and when you want to interview them, then yeah, maybe it would be a really good investment of your time and effort to ask them if things have changed, like they can reflect on things differently. But if it's been pretty recent or if a lot of the questions that you would want to ask were already asked in the other interview, then it's probably a better decision to just use that interview that's already been created, and then you can go on and ask somebody else some more questions and add another voice to the historical record. And so as Malinda was talking about, it's really important to identify the scope and really pick places that you want to focus on, different types of involvement of the people that you want to interview. If you want to have somebody who is actively involved, like marching down the street doing all these things, or if you want to ask somebody who's an observer, those are just things to consider. One place to find people if you're kind of stumped on where to email people would be your archive. So if you live close to a college or university, chances are they probably have a really rich archive where they have old newspapers, old organization records, notes about events, and you can find different people that were involved just from the names in the archive, and I'm sure that the archivist there would be more than happy to help you with that kind of research. And so that's a good place to get names in the first place, or learn about events that you didn't even know were happening. Another really good resource is actually local historians or people at local cultural or heritage centers. These people are often very, very passionate about their local history and are just kind of waiting for somebody to actually care as much as they do. I've recently been working with a student who's doing some oral histories in a small African-American community called Juneau-Alaska. It's near Boone, North Carolina. And I helped him get in contact with the woman who has sort of been running this local heritage center. And you can tell that this is like what she lives and breathes for. It's really important to her that her community story is heard. And so once he got in contact with her, he conducted an initial interview with her. And throughout the interview, it seemed like every time that she changed to a new story, she would say, oh, and this woman was involved with this event. Like, she would have a really good perspective. You should talk to her. And these kinds of people can point you in the right direction. They often have really close ties within their community, so they can actually get you the contact information. They can tell you the phone number to call or like where you can meet them. And then they can also help you find other archival types of research material that would be really useful for the interview. And then in terms of actually contacting them, places that you can look to find their contact info, a lot of times it's just as easy as Googling it, or you can use whitepages.com. Church directories are another good place. And then when you're thinking about contacting them, it's probably important to think about the method of communication that would be most comfortable for them. Some people are really okay with email. Some people would definitely prefer a phone call. And so you have to just kind of do your own judgment call there, like what would make them feel most comfortable, what's the best way to reach out to them so that you're making them feel invited and kind of letting them answer things on their own terms.
Yeah, Seth is really our kind of in-house expert on working with communities, meaning not just individuals in communities, but people who represent individuals in communities and people who work with kind of nonprofit and other types of organizations. The kinds of folks in historical societies or other people that JC was talking about. At SOHP, we have brought those folks routinely into our research projects as consultants, but then also as directors, in some cases, co-directors. So Seth can talk a little bit more about the importance of those advisory boards and kind of outreach in the planning stage of the process, not just after the interviews are over.
Yeah, well, hopefully just briefly. I suppose I'll speak for myself, or maybe I won't, but I have an issue if I'm an oral historian going into a community, a historically underrepresented community, right, that could also, or more often than not, is also going to be, I don't know, the term is sort of historically disadvantaged. I'm a white male academic here to tell them that your neighborhood is actually of historic significance, and I'm going to do a research project on it now. I'll be writing a monograph that will get me tenure, in a few years. And if you can find time to make it to the university library, you are welcome to check it out. There's a real kind of problem with that, and I think that the first way to get around that problem is to simply acknowledge that as a researcher, you are gaining a benefit from interacting with this community that may, in the minds of the people that you're talking to, outweigh the benefit that they get from speaking to you. This raises ethical questions that we'll get to eventually. One way to at least forefront or address the question of the sort of inequity of whether it's intellectual power, social capital, sort of historically aggregated social power, is to earnestly and straightforwardly and honestly bring a community into the conversation around the project and help them shape the project. If the community doesn't want to do the project, you're in trouble. But gathering a group of these gatekeepers, people who are influential members of their community who can talk to you and hopefully have the time to talk to you about the questions that have arisen in their own thinking about the histories of their communities can really go a long way towards A, making your project successful, but more importantly, in really engaging a group of people around the questions that you want to ask, and refining your questions around the questions that people in the communities have about their own experiences. So recently, we brought together a group of people. We were working on a project on public radio and media and all sort of alternative media in the South during and after the Civil Rights Movement. And so we had identified some people who, through archival research, who we knew were founding members of these certain public radio stations. And they were fairly nearby. And so we brought them to sort of a roundtable conversation. A couple of founders of the radio station WDSP up in Warrenton, North Carolina, a couple of people from WAFR in Durham, North Carolina, a couple of other people who had run a news service, again in the Triangle part of North Carolina, and just sat down at a table, had some coffee and bagels, and just sort of talked about their history. What have you been thinking about lately? Have you been thinking about this lately? How do you respond to us coming and sort of talking to you about this? Are you willing to work with us to do this kind of thing? So 2 years later, we're 35 interviews into a project. We've interviewed all the people who were sitting around that table. They have given us the names of the staffers who work for them, names of people who helped them get off the ground, the names of people that don't appear in the early records, which may or may not exist, because this was kind of a manic effort to put together a radio station. And we've really built sort of a community around the project that's been really helpful to us in understanding the basic questions that we're trying to get at with our oral history interviews, but also in really doing a project that is actually engaged and that does hopefully break down some of those barriers between the academy or even between the individual with the sort of privilege of information and a community that might otherwise feel sort of excluded. And at UNC, it's a public university. It's also a university that was built by slaves. It's has a fairly diverse student body. There's also this wall around it that cuts it off from a African-American neighborhood to the north that's being sort of gentrified in controversial ways. So there's lots of ways in which, as people who are at universities, libraries, high school teachers even, that we need to take that extra step to reach out. In committing ourselves to listening to people's history, we need to listen to that community kind of as a whole, as well as the individual stories, and then stay in touch with them about how the projects unfold. So we all have the reality, too, of the fact that at some point our project will end, and we will create a scholarly product of some kind. It might be a book or an exhibition or a documentary or something of that nature. It will be rare that your project will be something sort of an ongoing endeavor, although that's certainly not out of the question, and that in many ways would be great. Having that group of people around you is a good way to keep a community informed about the life cycle of a project. It's very easy if you're doing a big set of interviews with a big group of people. You interview one person in 2013, and you might not get to your 25th interview until 2015, and meanwhile that person's sitting around wondering what's going on with the project. If you have a way to sort of systematize just speaking frankly about what you're working on now, where things are going, and the fact that, you've applied for a job somewhere else and you might not be here next year, can help people sort of sundown an oral history project that feels like something that should be an ongoing conversation. Because the history that you're listening to and doing research on, it doesn't end just because you're not listening anymore, because you move on. And so all this is just to say that building a community around your group, whether it's 3 or 4 people who are willing to meet with you once or twice a year over coffee, or whether it's a sort of more formal group that includes academics and members of the community that you're in, can, I'm going to use such an academic word right now, can reify the sort of community around your project that will allow you to jumpstart it by connecting you to that community, and may allow you to end it in a way that makes sense to everybody involved. Or that community might allow you to perpetuate the project as long as need be, if this is in fact going to be your life's work, or if you feel compelled to keep working on it in one way or another, or if you have students or others who will.
Or they might take it over themselves.
Exactly.
Which is kind of the best case scenario.
Exactly, and we have a great project that we're only just starting on, we hope we're only just starting on, involved with the Moral Monday protests in North Carolina, which are these protests around some historic changes, political changes in North Carolina, and the sort of fallout from those. And there's been kind of a mass movement that's called Moral Monday, gathering at the state legislature every Monday. And we're working with members of that movement to train them to interview one another about their experiences as activists. Once we've done that training, we'd love to stay in touch with them, and we hope that we'll hear all their stories and help them along. But those interviews could be ongoing for years and years and years without us knowing anything about it. And in a way, understanding the interview as something that can be about community building and about culture building without the interference or context given by an academic historian, that has great value even if you can't put it in your tenure portfolio.
I have a question.
Yes. Oh, yeah, of course.
And then I realize we're going to get to this later, but I still feel it's actually part of creating, which is the archiving the interview piece.
Sure.
And so especially when you're talking about, community, and yet you might be moving on. Who is holding these I mean, for instance, are you as an individual, are you housing them already because of your affiliation? And how does that become part of the discussion of you asking participants who want to know, well, what's going to happen, where is it going to be stored? And so I realize that while it's on the agenda here for coming up later, I actually think, to me, it's very much part of the
That is
initial
part of
process.
project planning. Yeah, asking yourself the question, what's going to happen to these interviews after they're over? Will I keep them on my hard drive? Will I share them automatically with the folks who I've interviewed or another kind of community group or my board that I've gotten together? Is there a community library or other kind of historical organization that could keep these interviews also on a hard drive? Is there a university relationship that you can establish? In our experience, all of those things are possible, and different situations are desirable depending on the project. I think we work with a lot of scholars in particular who do, 80, 120, 150, 200 interviews and keep them on their hard drive, on an external hard drive that gets backed up, at all times. But they kind of hold on to those interviews while they're working on their book manuscript, or the articles that are going to derive from this project. Then they often will donate those interviews to the Southern Oral History Program collection at UNC. But there's a million different ways to preserve this material, and how you plan the project really does depend on what kinds of resources might be available to you and to the people you're working with to keep the interviews. I mean, certainly one of the fundamental assumptions we operate with, and y'all feel free to disagree with me, but I mean, for me anyway, as an oral historian, if the interview is going to disappear, or if I'm worried that the interview is going to disappear, particularly the audio tape, then I might as well not do it. I really need to be doing something else with my time. So I'm glad you asked that question, because it's a fundamental aspect of planning the project to figure out what can and what should happen. And if you don't have resources, for example, at your university, say you're not running a big oral history program, which I don't imagine most of you are, if you don't have the resources yourselves, that's when, in the project planning stage, you start building relationships with other people that do have resources. We, for example, if you're doing projects on the South, we, for example, have interviews in our collection that were not completed by our staff or our students. There are other libraries in your regions that also, if they don't have an established process for taking care of oral histories, you can talk to them about that and make them aware.
And I will say too, so if you're planning on archiving your materials, if you want to make them accessible, talk to somebody at a university or college or library nearby, and talk to them early, talk to them often. They can help you a lot in terms of explaining how you should be saving the things, where you should be saving them. They can help you with the whole long-term preservation. They can help you with the access piece. And it's pretty much, there are some overall archival standards, but each institution generally has its own practices. And so if you're going to be, if you want to collaborate with them, the earlier you belong to them, the better, so that you can be doing the right things.
Okay, I guess my question is more so, for instance, if you're approaching someone and you're saying at the time you don't have, this isn't going to go into a collection, or it's your own for the moment, right? Then why, let's say then later on down the road, I'm moving on from my project, I don't have ownership, but for instance, the initial agreement, even with the consent form and all of that material, is not necessarily that I'm going to then take someone else's recording and then give it to an archive to make public in a way that even though the interviewee wasn't aware of, it would be public to quite an extent. I don't know. I guess I'm sort of wondering. I realize you can wants
Are you
to.
wondering why they would want to do it if you weren't going to say give it to a library?
No, I mean, I'm saying from a
No.
very beginning standpoint, saying, hi, let's approach communities, people agree to an interview for a particular, whether it's a student project and even if they have them up on a college website, to me, that's a different thing than saying, I'm going to, now, because I have possession of the recording of the story, I'm going to take it to this university archive and give it to them.
Right. I think that's important we'll talk more about this later, but it's important to know, at least from our ethical assumptions, that you can't really do that. not without the more discussion and research and involvement from the interviewee, from your advisory board, from the folks that you're collaborating with. Because again, they might have given you consent to do the interview, but just as you said, you don't own it, right? So
my question kind of answers a little of yours and asks a little bit beyond IRBs. Okay.
Right.
Right.
Can we wait
Yes,
actually,
yes,
because we are going to talk about our
Right.
IRBs and what that means in a little while. I was going
Can I have one
Yeah.
yes on it? So this is a very, very, very good question, and it may remain open, but that it remains open means we can keep talking about. One of the luxuries, perhaps, of digital recording is that you don't always have to make a single choice about where something is, and so things can exist digitally in a variety of different repositories, personal collections, homes, etc. So the researcher is no longer sort of taking their box of stuff from one place to another. So there are ways to craft a release form or something like that that might allow for that kind of transfer in a way that everyone is comfortable with, and that shares ownership rather than transfers it, and shares deposit rather than selects a single place to go.
Yes. Yeah, JC and Seth are both going to talk about the types of release forms and consent forms that allow for that similar mobility while keeping within the boundaries of the sort of assumption that the interviewee shares the story. I was going to talk for a few minutes about costs and budgeting and all that boring stuff, but actually I think it might be more interesting to move on to what our sort of next discussion was going to be, which is going to ask each of you to talk to each other and to us about what kind of projects you're working on and the status of those projects. I think it would be easy if folks wanted to stay at their tables, but we have a kind of table of 3 over here that if there's a table of 2 in the back, maybe you want to come join our table of 3, or folks could kind of move around freely, but mainly we wanted you to describe to each other the projects you're working on, because at least from the feedback we got, almost everybody got a project that is ongoing, or they're starting, or thinking about starting. Talk about the status of that project, and then come up with some, if you have any questions that arise out of that discussion for us and for each other, we can spend the last few minutes before our break talking about trying to flesh out more questions, ethical and otherwise. So take about 15 minutes maybe and describe for each other what you're
Not really, but I can make it.
As I mentioned before the break, we're going to go through some techniques about interviewing. We know some of you, of course, are very experienced interviewers, and we're also going to do an exercise which will put you in the position of being an interviewee, in case you've never done that before. But I'll ask Rachel to guide us through how this works.
So in your packet, you should have this transcript of an interview. It says at the top, case study, interview with Ann Queen. And what I want you to do is just read it, and then we'll talk a little bit about your kind of gut reactions to this interview and what you see happening in the interview itself. Do you need more time, or you can't tell? So what's your sort of gut reaction to what you see on the page here?
Not good. Not good.
Not good.
No, not really. I mean, she's not asking open-ended questions. And of course, I'm not
I'm not certain what the purpose was specifically. Maybe closed-end questions were, but I mean, the interviewer seems to be forcing the interviewee into a very tunnel-like.
Well, and beyond that, there's a whole construction of this is exactly how it happened, and then confirm this yes or no.
Yes, yes, yeah.
So she's clearly done a lot of research, and this is what I was saying before. She's done a lot of good research. In fact, I think she's holding like a timeline in front of her and sort of asking. But right, what kind of interview does this remind you of?
Almost like an interrogation.
An interrogation. You might hear this kind of interview in court. It's like she's been watching police, or something. So this is a good example of what not to do. Unfortunately, what got cut off at the bottom is that when she says, "Yeah, could you tell me much more about that because I'm not really familiar with its activities," the interview opens up. And Anne Queen is then able to sort of tell her this wonderful long story. And so it's actually when she admits she doesn't know something that the interview succeeds. And she, until that moment, she's been trying to sort of prove, what she knows and get it confirmed. The other thing that is, lucky for her is that Anne Queen says, "Here, if it's all right, it's all right for me to just take a little bit of time." Anne Queen, by this time, is a very established person at UNC. She's been there for decades. She's worked with undergraduates for years. She's not afraid to sort of say, "Kid, like, hang on, let me tell." But not all interviewees would have that ability to do that, which is why this is not how you want to go about it.
So the other thing that stood out to me in this is that the pattern of saying curiosity is the most important thing. Because Anne Queen, in several of these, would say, "Okay, yes, but," and then the interviewer would ignore that, all those perfect opportunities to get more information. The other thing is reading that, I also think I could see myself doing that.
We've all kind of done it. I mean, especially if you think that, if you go into oral history assuming that you're there to gain facts or to talk specifically about, to kind of extract a certain amount of knowledge, so-called, from the interview, we will often just trip over ourselves completely. And as Jacqueline Hall said to our group last week, the interviewee saves us, by saying wait or saying but, and then eventually we kind of clue in that the line of our questioning is not particularly fruitful.
So, okay, so that's an example of what not to do, and it's pretty obvious to most people but we don't want you coming out of here just feeling nervous, because clearly it is possible to mess up. But like we were saying, we all mess up at some point, all of us. And I'll play you a clip of one of our absolutely best interviewers, kind of goofing. Like it's not the best example of her work, but we want to know kind of what's making you. When we were walking around, we were hearing a lot of questions. People were coming up. So in terms of actually doing the interview, what makes you nervous? What are your questions? What do you want to know about the process of actually interviewing somebody? Are there things that make you anxious or you want? Yeah.
Well, I have a question. I'm talking about here because like I said, it's high school students, and if they interview veterans or other people, but sometimes it's veterans, and they're told something that, I mean, sometimes they have interviewed people who describe very graphic detail, actions that they took, and sometimes it not necessarily has to do with combat, and I guess that one question is there at some point, is there legal or ethical issue with being told something in an interview that might have been something that the person did that was illegal? I mean, what do you do with that kind of information?
Not really. I mean, is there one? It's a really good question.
Because it confronts us all the time.
And it's a case-by-case thing. We've seen the stories recently about Boston College promising anonymity to people who participated in IRA bombings and not being able to give that anonymity. I suppose your responsibility as an interviewer is to think about how you would respond to a situation like that if it arose. Think
about it ahead of time.
Ahead of time,
Yeah.
right. And think about a sort of a slate of potential reactions. In the past, when we had interviews that were on cassette and on typescript, we could be fairly certain that that information would be pretty well buried, and there were kind of easy ways to make sure it was even more buried. That is to say, don't transcribe that portion of the interview and restrict listening, for instance. If we're recording things digitally and distributing them digitally, that does change things. The publicness of that confession is much more public than it might be if the cassette were in a box with a typescript. At the same time, you're able to sort of permanently remove a portion from an audio interview if you feel compelled to do so. I think that if you're working as part of an institution which has an RV, which we'll talk about these details, they may have very specific policies about this kind of thing. I had an instance recently where an interview was conducted by a team of people that I was working with, where the interviewees were describing a fairly common practice in civil rights marches where the marchers would be marching along and there would be some cars following them with food and things of that nature. And one of these cars had a bunch of guns in it, in case things got bad. And this car drove over the border between Louisiana and Mississippi. People telling the story were concerned that that meant they were trafficking weapons over state lines, which would be a federal crime without a statute of limitations around it to protect them. And we had to talk with them about the potential ways in which we could handle this material. And when it came down to it, my determination as an advisor to the group that was doing this was that basically you need to find a way to be comfortable with the interviewee making a decision about what they're willing to reveal, and the institution making a decision about the extent to which they're willing to conceal or not conceal it. The group in question happened to be the Library of Congress, and so I was just sort of a little small creature kind of tugging at their pant leg to this, to make sure everyone's comfortable with this. But in the end, that decision was made by an attorney, or will be made by an attorney before the material is made public. And the question is just you delete that out of the digital file and don't transcribe it at all, and it's gone. In the same way that you might snip it out of the tape. Or perhaps more challenging would be considering if you feel an obligation yourself to report some kind of activity that this person is confessing to, basically, and what are your legal obligations. And this goes beyond my expertise. If someone's actually talking about the commission of a crime, I don't actually know what your responsibilities are. But you
actually,
should talk to an
in
attorney.
case of, say, incest or child abuse or something that is clearly victimizing someone who is not otherwise able to speak for themselves. I mean, just as Seth said, there's just questions that you have to ask yourself ahead of time as you're planning the project and as you're thinking about interviewing specific people who are part of the project. And then getting comfortable with being in this interstitial space where you don't have all the answers. As researchers, we get very comfortable with the idea that we have the answers, or we're going to go find the answers, if we don't have them right now. And being an oral historian, basically, if you wake up every day and you just realize you don't have really the answers. And so but your responsibility, we can't speak to what your legal responsibility is because your institution would speak to that, your institution would have lawyers that would speak to that, there would be other kind of factors involved around certain types of activities that would be revealed. But we do share experiences that I think add up to the importance of getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, and the importance of understanding that you're not in control of the story. Now there's a couple of, like in my experience, there's a couple of sort of practical things when those types of situations occur, especially if you're teaching students, for example, and the students are the ones who are confronting these issues. They can cut off the tape recorder. Then you can tell the interview. I mean, I always have made it a practice when I've sort of sat down with somebody to interview them to say, this is your story, thank you, I'm very grateful for your willingness to share it. We can stop the recorder at any time, and particularly also because I've interviewed a lot of people who I have kinship relations to or other sort of whatever community shared things with. They'll just tell me something because they know me, or they think it's important for me to know it, but they don't want it to go on the tape. And so then, of course, as a researcher, I have to remember, I'm not going to use that later. but it is something that I know, and so it's kind of in my memory bank about history. So cutting off the tape, I think, is a great option.
And I think also there's a way in which sometimes you need to take the sort of power of the interviewer and cut the tape off for them.
Yeah.
If they're feeling like they have an obligation to keep talking, that's sort of a false obligation.
Mm-hmm.
You might say, oh, do you need me to turn the recorder off? And they say, oh, no. Right? Sometimes you need to cut it off and then say, listen, let's turn this back on when you're ready to go. Then when you turn it back on, you talk to them about what's going on.
Yeah.
If they're ready to continue, you turn it back on, make a brief verbal note, hey, we're just resuming this after a pause, and keep going. So that people coming to it later kind of know what happened. But you're sort of taking the decision, like the fairly weighty decision to pause the interview off the table for the interviewee and allowing them to decide to turn it back on.
And that's about being comfortable in your own skin, being comfortable with the person that you're talking to be, have that little kind of back and forth.
And it can be very challenging, and I think, so I had an experience not that long ago where I was interviewing someone, and she really didn't mean to, but she sort of suddenly admitted or revealed that she was the victim of incest. And this became a big part of the interview. And it's very hard to hold that. You're listening so hard and trying to figure out how do I respond to this? What's my responsibility as an interviewer? And I had told her that we could stop the tape, but ahead of time. But I didn't in the moment say, "Do you want me to stop the tape?" Because she clearly now needed to tell the story. But so in the end, she decided to close the interview for some number of years. And I asked her about it afterwards, and she said, well, actually now I think, having just told you all this, now I think I'm glad I told you because I want other women to know that this does not necessarily define you for the rest of your life, and that you can move on from this, and
So the reflection is ongoing.
Yeah.
And JC we'll talk a little bit right now about restrictions on interviews and the kind of, if you can't pause or don't pause in the moment when something like that is being revealed, then what are our options?
Right, and we'll go over more specifics with release forms too later, but with restrictions, you can offer them a restriction that they can enforce after the interview, and it's good practice to offer them, to give them the release form and then say, here's our restriction options after they've actually done the interview, and they go into it and have them sign it, and then do the interview. That doesn't really give them a chance to reflect on how public they really want this to be. So after the interview, you can say, if we have these options, we can close it for 5 years, or we can close it for 10 years, whatever you want to do. And two other things, I guess. If they don't choose to restrict the interview on their own, and you feel like it should be closed for an amount of time, I think that's an okay decision to make. Sometimes they might say things that they don't really consider to be damaging or harmful to anyone else, but if you feel like there's really sensitive information in the interview, I think that's an okay decision that you can enforce. And then another piece of that is sometimes people don't really think about everything that they've said until they've actually either gone back and listened to the interview or reread the transcript. And so our policy is always to send the transcript back to the interviewees, have them look it over, give them the chance to say, I changed my mind, I do want to restrict access to this interview for X amount of years. Or if they want to close pieces of that, then you can start moving forward that way by, removing pieces of information from the transcript and working to take it out of digital audio too. So there are a lot of options.
Yeah, and there's options that can be exercised at different stages of the process. So in particular, I think if you're teaching students how to deal with this, it's going to make them very nervous what to do in the moment. But then as teachers, we can do what we do, which is to give them some context, give them some options, and also help them continue to work with the interviewee to help the interviewee, give the interviewee as many opportunities to exercise his or her preferences as possible.
So what, are there other things that make you nervous, or is this?
So for me, I have, unlike this interviewer, so I'm looking at Berkeley in the 60s with healthcare stuff. I can do research into big general things. I know about People's Park, I know what's happening internationally, I know a few key experiences.
but because I don't have the archival information, especially in the early days. I think as I go along, I'll be able to piece it together. When I'm first going and talking to some of these key figures, I'm a little unsure how to ask some of the beginning questions when I know general stuff, but I don't know any of the specific stuff, so it's kind of like, tell me everything, which isn't going to get me a lot. So trying to figure out how to ask some directed questions that are also open-ended.
Well, do you want to, we plan to talk about different types of questions to ask.
Sure. So, I mean, all right, let's talk about this and see if it answers that. But yeah, I think it is hard if you really don't know what happened. It's hard to, but I think what happens is you develop your questions over time. So the first few interviewees will give you the baseline, and then you can use those to formulate questions for the next few. And then you can also go back to those original interviewees and say, well, now that I've learned more, I want to come back and ask you about these, something I didn't ask you about at the beginning. So that may be one way to go about it. When we're creating our list of questions, we try to think in these three ways. So narrative questions, lyrical questions, and reflective questions. And different people have different names for these types of questions. But basically, there's a type of question, the narrative, that just asks people to describe what happened, right? So can you describe for me, or I'd love to hear more about the time when, you did that, or and asks them to describe an event, or to describe their daily life, or to describe their family, or those kinds of things. So then lyrical questions are the ones where you ask people about how something felt. So if someone says, I grew up in a family with 7 kids, and the youngest of them actually, got sick and died when she was 3, and sort of tells that story. Follow-up questions can sometimes be lyrical questions about, well, how did it feel to be the oldest of 7 kids? Or, how did it, what was your sort of emotional life like at that point when she died? What do you remember about your response to something, or those kinds of things? And then reflective questions are another good kind of follow-up question. They're also good to build into your sort of question outline, which are looking back, how do you think that particular experience affected you? So the first two are asking people to remember what it was like at the time. The last one is, from your vantage point now, how do you think that experience affected you over time, or how important do you think it was? So asking them to reflect back on something from their time today. So you can, we go into interviews with a list of 10 or 12 or 15 questions that we've created ahead of time, but like we were saying before, we're not limited to those, and we probably won't get to all of them, because we let the interviewee be the leader in this. Where they want to go with their story, we will follow them, and we are asking follow-up questions. Now, there may be a few questions that we really want to be sure to get to, because, for instance, if we're doing a project and we're going to interview 20 people about something, there may be a couple of questions where we want to ask everybody pretty much the same thing, so we can kind of compare their answers and things. But we adjust to the individual stories that we're hearing and ask follow-up questions. So while we may have all of these kinds of questions laid out in our list, we're also thinking about them in terms of follow-up. So if someone tells you a story, but it's very narrative, it doesn't go into their kind of emotional response or something, you can ask one of these questions, because that is in fact what oral history lets us do that an archival kind of research wouldn't. We can ask somebody about their feelings, and that's part of the richness of oral history, is getting to those emotions, getting to the memories, getting to how they think about those experiences now.
And sometimes how they think about how other people thought or think about those experiences. I mean, there's there's just 1,000 different types of follow-up questions that these open-ended questions can prompt. And I think all of us have in common the idea that, again, listening to what the interviewee is imparting to you will then yield kind of the richest, most productive information, not just for your project, but for all the future researchers that will hopefully be, using this material.
I always tell my students, and they never believe me at the beginning, that they will come out of, if they're doing it right, that they will come out of one of these interviews completely exhausted, because you're listening so hard as you go, and you're watching body language, and you're thinking about what's being said and what's not being said. I mean, that level of attention is the most important thing, and is what makes the difference between a good interview and not. And it's emotionally, intellectually, and even physically sort of exhausting. So if you're teaching students, one thing I do tell them is, make sure there's enough time for the interview so that you're not rushed, and they don't feel rushed, and you're trying to just get through your questions. But also leave yourself time afterwards, because you're going to need some downtime after this. You're going to need to kind of process it. You don't want to be doing this interview, half an hour before you have a final exam or something. I mean, you need to sort of give the interviewee and yourself time so that this can open up in all the ways that it needs to do.
Does that sort of answer your question about questions?
It does. I have another question.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's get to maybe a few other things about what makes people nervous about this process.
Yeah.
Well, I do research on lesbian feminism, excuse me, in the 60s and 70s primarily. And so people know that I'm going to be talking to them about sexuality, which can be sometimes, including sensitive topics. So one of my concerns is how to sometimes push into areas that are sensitive and asking questions without potentially, say, shutting down an interview. So an example is speaking with a trans woman who is part of the lesbian scene in San Francisco. And it's well documented that she is trans, but in the interview she only spoke from the perspective of a lesbian woman. And so I wasn't sure, if I pushed to really get the trans experience, if that would just then end the interview.
Mm-hmm.
So how to kind of navigate a sensitive
Our
areas.
undergraduate interns are doing a project this year on LGBTQ student activism at UNC, and we've run into at least one example of, not being, the person not being willing to identify as either male or female. So, there's all kinds of assumptions that interviewees start out with that complicate.
One thing, I don't know if you've come across this book. There's a whole new book on the practice of,
Nan Boyd's book.
Is it Dana Boyd's book?
Nan Boyd did one on queer oral history.
Yeah. What
is it called?
I think it's Queer Oral History, or
I'll double check the title.
Yeah. Can't quite remember. I think it maybe has bodies of evidence.
Bodies of evidence.
It's co-edited, isn't it?
I'll double check here.
Yeah. But yeah, and I think that pushing thing is something that makes a lot of people anxious about how do you know how far to push. And I think it's really, we don't want to make people tell a story that they don't want to tell. They're really in charge of where this, but I think it would be fair to ask someone, to say, I know from this article about you, or that there's a trans experience. Do you want to talk about that? Is that an important part of this story? And if they don't want to talk about it, I don't think that would shut down the interview. I think they might just say, no, I don't want to talk about that.
There's all these are very, common identity questions
Right.
too. I mean, I just got back from a trip to Mississippi where I wasn't really doing formal oral histories, but it was more kind of I was just introducing myself to a bunch of people, basically. And some part of the project relates to African Americans in Mississippi who have Native American ancestry. And a lot of people who identify as African American, who I was speaking with, have very different attitudes about talking about that part of their family experience. Sometimes folks would come out straight out and tell me, I don't want to talk about it, like we were never allowed to talk about it. And they might reflect on why, but they're then not going to kind of give me any actual data, so-called, that might be useful for historical investigation, as much as their reflections on why are incredibly useful for a study of identity. And then I'd have other people who would say, yeah, we have it, not really important, or here's a whole bunch of, here's my genealogy. So it started to illuminate for me as I was sort of getting these radically different responses to slightly sensitive areas, that maybe I was asking the wrong question. Not just of this interview or interviewee, but of kind of the entire project. And it just takes me back to the project planning and how you're always replanning your project, even in the middle of, the kind of interview practice. And understanding that I'm asking the wrong questions because there's just a material that is not accessible to me is a really, important insight that interviewees are always giving us, I think.
So I was wondering, even when I was listening to you and others talk about interviewing people who are about a period that happened maybe 50 years ago or 40 years ago in the setting that you just outlined, like race relations. How do you establish, I was wondering about memory, like it is not okay, it's not politically correct to say today that when 50 years ago I really did not like white people, or I did not really like black people, or I had racist thoughts. So how do you, as a historian, navigate those very troubled waters? That is not unlike the question about sexuality, right? Mm-hmm. Somebody's not going to say, I was trans or I am trans. Do you talk about, can you tell me about your neighbors? Mm. Do you deflect attention so that it's easier perhaps to say that my neighbors were? Mm-hmm. How do you navigate the memory of today that already erased, right? Or put makeup on your older self who was sexist or racist or...
And a lot of people too aren't that reflective necessarily about their lives, who otherwise, are really important participants in various things we're interested in. I would actually really love for somebody else in the group to maybe address that question, because I know that people have thoughts about those things, or experiences that they can call on.
Well, I think it's important when you're interviewing somebody to try to develop the context of the experience as much as possible, and ask as many questions as you can about what was going on at that time, and not ask somebody if they had racist thoughts, but more open-ended questions about maybe their relationships to these issues or something like that.
Sometimes I've asked people about movies, like, did you remember seeing To Kill a Mockingbird? Or some movie that kind of lives in that maybe came out at the time that, we're talking about in their lives, that perhaps they would have a response to, that would elucidate something about their kind of mentality now and then. And I think what you're asking is, how do we as historians distinguish between the now and the then? And that's partly our job. It's not always the interviewee's job, I think, to make those distinctions, especially if you're doing a project that looks at that dozens of interviews, say, about a particular time period or event. We're going to be putting together from those interviews these sorts of notions about historical memory and about identity and about, change from these various interviews. So it's hard, and it makes it difficult if our expectation is that the interviewee, I think, is going to reveal a reflective, conclusion that they've drawn. Sometimes they will, and like I said, I might deflect, or I might ask about something different if I think they might go that way, but then if I try and I fail, I just fail.
Well, it's reminding me that I had a documentary filmmaker call me recently and basically ask for oral histories in which white people talk about being really racist. And I was like, that's really hard to find. But, we don't have a lot of those. Right. Yeah. So it's a very complicated.
And, you might, if you want to do a project about that, it'd be interesting to go ask people about and confront them with a certain concept like being a race traitor, and see how they respond to that. But you might not compare.
Talk about the theoretical. If within oral history theorizing, there are texts about the issue of memory,
right?
And I think that there have to be.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, there definitely are, and one of the things we say to students a lot, and we talk about, is that how someone remembers themselves or an event, that's actually what we're interested in. How do they remember it, and why do they, and our job is to try to understand why they remember it in a particular way, or what we can learn from how they remember it. That's more important than whether it's accurate. It is true to them, right? But whether it matches what a photograph would show us from that time, or a newspaper report from that time, it doesn't matter if it's inaccurate or wrong. What matters is how they remember it and why they remembered it that way, and what does that tell us about the experience.
Yeah, and these various perspectives on history, even if you're an archival historian who never works with oral history, one of your fundamental jobs is to understand an event or a time period from different points of view. And so those oral histories, even if they're not so-called accurate, or we can't get to accuracy, we can get to perspective very easily.
I want to comment on we're just trying to find out what they remember now. Sometimes people fall into the same, telling the story the way they told it a million times because this is an important part. They like people, always ask them about that. I think it is valid to try to trouble their usual story in order to bring out new memories.
And I always tell my students to try to learn and pay attention to what are sort of marker words that's what's going on. So for instance, we are all taught how to tell stories about challenges and opportunities, right? We look back on something that was really difficult and we frame it as a challenge, which then turned into an opportunity that I overcame. That's how we talk in job interviews. That's how that's how we're taught to talk publicly about something difficult in our life. And that's when these follow-up questions, if you hear somebody talking about a challenge, it's really good to stop and say, well, that sounds like it might have been difficult. Can you tell me how that felt? Right? Or what do you remember about your kind of emotional response to that?
Interrupt them.
Interrupt that public story that they've told a million times. I mean, not literally interrupt them, but once they're done with it, kind of go back and say, that's a really amazing story. Can you tell me more about one of these things, or reflect back on it now, or something like that. So learning to recognize nervous laughter, learning to recognize I don't know usually means I'm not sure I want to talk about that. There's lots of little words and phrases that people use that really mean something else. And learning to recognize those and pay attention to them. Learning to let silence do its job. Let somebody be quiet for a minute. You don't necessarily have to jump in and move on and fill. They may be really thinking something through, and if you just let them be for a minute, you'll get a really good story or answer. So yeah, I think that I think you're right that sometimes we're dealing with people who've really never had a chance to tell their story. Sometimes we're dealing with people who've told their story 1,000,000 times, and our job is to kind of get under that and get behind the public voice. Yeah.
I've interviewed people that have gone through trauma, and it was very emotional, and it was relatively new to them, and it kind of all came out in a flood. And in one or two, I kind of lost control because they started asking me questions, and they wanted me to answer things for them. And is there any way that you, when they start asking you questions about the event, and any information you might have about it to make their point of view, to kind of fill in the blanks for them, how do you?
I mean, were they asking you to sort of validate their experience, or what were they?
Well, it was.
Or they were asking you to talk about your own experience?
It was about Katrina, and they had experienced a small portion of it, and they were asking, in my research, did I find out why they went here instead of here, and why they helped these people instead of these people, so they kept asking me questions.
I think you answered their questions to the extent that you can. I mean, if there's things that you don't know that they're asking.
You can also say, I don't know, but after the interview, I'd be happy to do a little research for you, or, if you have access to a type of information that they might not have access to for whatever reason, or something like that. But
so it's okay to just go in to your information.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is a relationship that you're building, and in the best case scenario, like if you get to a stopping place where you can no longer sort of interrogate, not in a court sense, but you can no longer kind of push on one or another question. You're building a relationship so that you could circle back at the end of the interview, or that you can come back, you can go visit them another time, maybe weeks, months, even years later, and ask again, because you know more as a researcher. They've had an opportunity to kind of know what this experience of being interviewed means and how it prompts trauma for them or other reflective types of experiences for them. And so I think what we do is that we always approach the interview as a relationship building exercise, and that it is an important responsibility that we have because of the privilege of the environments that many of us are in. We do have access to information that interviewees don't necessarily have access to. And so I've always looked at it like, if somebody asks me to do something for them, I'm going to do it, because whether in that moment or later, because they're giving me, a tremendous amount.
I mean, on the other hand, in an interview, some of my students have said that they, particularly if they're interviewing someone their own age, that they find it very difficult not to just get into a conversation. And I do.
That's one end of the spectrum.
I do try to help teach them not to do that. That this should not end up being you telling a long story, and then they tell a long story, and then you tell, that is not your job. But if they're asking you directly for information or questions, I think if it's something beyond your expertise, or you don't feel comfortable answering it, I think it's fine to say, I don't know, I'm not comfortable, but I could help you find that information later.
Did you look? We should kind of need to do it.
This ties to exactly here.
Okay, we also had somebody who had a question before. Did you?
It's a follow-up to this. Fits in well. I've had people repeatedly say to me, well, you're from this institution, you're the expert, you know more than me. And I've, say things like, no, I'm here to listen to you, I'm really, that's why I want to talk with you, because you know more than I do, but then, and this is why, say those kind of things to say, no, this is really, I don't know, but then when I say I don't know, then they go, well, you're from this set of institutions, you should know, right? So I find myself in these sort of rhetorical, games in circles, basically, trying to, trying to just to break up that sort of authority and power that comes from coming from certain places. And so I didn't know if there's other strategies for.
Well, Seth spoke to that almost, or started to speak to that at the
Yeah,
beginning about
earlier, that how do you
communities
break
and
that?
advisory boards. How do you handle that as an individual interviewer?
So I mean, it's a really challenging question, and the experience that I've more often had is people who say like, oh, this guy from my college wants to know this stuff from me, you know, and they kind of are feel empowered to talk and educate me because they sort of had assumed that someone from an institution would know this stuff, and by confessing that you don't, you actually elicit, as opposed to a pushback, you know, you shouldn't be telling me this kind of thing.
But you're from Yale, right?
Yeah.
I think it's, I went to graduate school, I think it's particularly intense in New Haven and with Yale and stuff. So it's a generalizable problem, but it's also particularly difficult in certain institutional settings.
And you know, I think this is certainly something that you've considered, but I think in your initial communication with the interviewee, framing the interview as a conversation that's not about revealing information to you, but about revealing their perspective, which you can't possibly know. And maybe in that moment, you know, you could say to them, yeah, you know, I've been really fortunate to do research on this subject, but one thing that I'm really having trouble understanding without talking to people about it is this very question. You know, what's your perspective on that? You know, what would you tell someone like me about you know, your very personal experiences with it?
Yeah.
That might be kind of a basic answer, but maybe that's just a way to say, well, listen, like I know that I know that you think that I know it all, but can you think a little bit about just that very personal element that you might have contributed to? We're not generating knowledge here. I want to hear about your experience.
Yeah, I think that's really the way to go about it. And one, you know, because one of the, and I don't know if you wanted to literally tell them this, but one of the things we always say is that the great thing about oral history is it flips the expert relationship. I mean, this person is always the expert on their life and on their perspective and on their experience. And so that's something for students to really learn from. It's a wonderful teaching tool, but to understand that yes, it's your responsibility to do a lot of research, but they're going to be the expert on this particular story, and you have to be, that's what the Anne Queen interview does not, you know, they don't get, right? So, and you could even say that to them, you know, and I'm interested in your perspective, and you're the expert on that. So I want, if you don't mind, because I think our time is.
Let's kind of ask JC to introduce that, because she just went through the same exercise they're about to ask y'all to do.
And we were going to bring up some different tips for interviewing, and I just wanted to point out there's a list of 10 tips in your handbooks that you got, so you can refer to those. But so, an exercise that we often do with the oral history seminar at UNC is, you can hear me a little bit better. So an exercise that we sometimes do at UNC with the oral history seminar is practicing actually giving an interview and then speaking back in that person's voice. So you can kind of see what it feels like to be both the interviewee and the interviewer, and then to hear somebody else interpreting your words. So you can just kind of, so it helps put you in the place of what your interviewee is actually feeling. So if you can find your partner and then spend about, I think, with how much time we have left, spend about 3 minutes asking your partner questions, and the topic that you can all talk on is your first time voting. What was your experience like the first time that you went to go vote? And then you can switch with your partner, so they'll ask you, and then spend another 3 or 4 minutes saying that back to your partner in their voice. So pretend Rachel and I are doing this, and I would say, I'm Rachel Seidman, my first time voting was this. So using the first person.
So you actually have to listen well enough so that at the end you can embody that person and say it back.
So spend about 3 or 4 minutes.
Okay.
always a fun question because people have great stories. And the first thing we wanted to ask you to do is would there be any volunteers to tell your partner's story to the whole group?
I'll do it.
Great.
I'll be on the program. All right. So I remember to be her though. So that's the thing. All right,
try to be her.
I'm gonna try to be her. So I'm Mandy Jolly, and the first election I voted in, presidential election, was the election of 2008, Obama versus McCain. And I knew going in that I was going to be voting for Obama. And at the time, I was living at home and taking classes at a community college, and so I did early voting. And I actually took my grandmother with me to vote, and I am the only declared Democrat in my family, and I actually remember having conversations of, oh, why are you going to vote for Obama, and all of this. And but I went in and knew, like I said, I knew who I was going to vote for. And I have a funny story. The next year, my grandmother actually voted for Obama. So, so they covered everything. Yeah.
Thank you. Would you like to tell his story?
Sure. So I'm Josh Poole, and my first presidential election vote was also in 2008. It was my first year in college. Wasn't sure going in what I was going to do, but I voted on the early voting because I was a college student, had classes on the day of the election. So I went in, and when most people were walking out within 2 or 3 minutes, knew exactly what they were going to do, I stood in the booth for like 10 minutes trying to decide. Kind of skipped over some of the lesser offices because I just ended up having to choose the name that sounded the best because I was so concerned on the presidential side. I've been raised in a Republican family, but found that more of the Democratic platform aligned with my personal beliefs, and so had this internal struggle of, do I go with my passions, my beliefs, or do I deal with the conversation when I get outside of the booth of who did you vote for? And so I had that conflict. Ended up choosing President Obama and feel positively about it after the fact, but I was still dealing with that concern on my family opinion.
Thank you. Other volunteers? Any other parents like to go? These people are getting late. I think we should they should go.
I'm having a very hard time doing anything on Hamilton first.
Yeah, that would be great.
You want me to go?
That would be great.
Okay. Well, my name is Dalila D'Souza, and I was raised in Mozambique, which was under the dictatorship at the time of Portugal. And the first time that I voted was in May of 1975, and it was a very memorable election because Portugal had been under a dictatorship, a fascist dictatorship since 1928. And this particular election was not only the first time that I got to vote, but it was the first time that all of the citizens of Portugal and their subjects were able to vote. And I was 18 years old at the time, and when I went to vote, everybody turned out. Everybody came out to vote, and it was a huge celebration.
Thank you. What did y'all learn by doing this and hearing it back?
Oh, well,
I mean, everybody got to be an interviewer and an interviewee, right?
There are details that don't come out in the interview that when you read it back, suddenly you realize you got it wrong. And so that was actually really valuable to read back and then say, no, that wasn't happening at the same time. Because that was how I had interpreted it. So.
Yeah. So the ways in which it does really teach you a lesson, I think, about how chronology works in people's minds. It doesn't work in orally at all the same way it works. It seems to work on paper. And since all knowledge gets transmitted orally first, it sort of even reminds us, those of us that work in archives, to be very suspicious of what gets written down, because people get confused easily. What else did you learn? Yeah, right there.
not just about the act of voting, but it really was a family story here. And I think we had some similar ones about neighborhood stories that came out from it. So in our questions, none of us really talked about voting, but we were talking about something else.
So it might even change our historical questions about civic participation, for example. If we talk maybe more about how families or relationships influence our beliefs, less about the kind of act of voting or other types of civic engagement, changes the way we discuss history.
Well, we had some of the experience that you were describing with that specific question. Neither of us could actually answer this. I can't actually remember going and voting, but we ended up talking about our thoughts about citizenship and our thoughts about the process, and we kind of came out of it and oh, there's some really interesting things that weren't the question, but ended up, like you were research would actually go.
Yeah, where research would actually go. Yes.
For us, place and space both played a role in recalling the experience. For me, I just remember that I was in the dorms. I don't remember what I was voting on. And then for Bethany, knew that she was in college, but was at home in a rural area.
Although I'm now thinking that was wrong. Now, I'm remembering watching in the dorms that night all the election coverage. So maybe I voted absentee. I'm not even sure.
So how place helps us recall experiences.
Yeah, that's a good interviewing technique too. I think when you find yourself sort of stuck around a particular question with it, asking them to think about where they were when they remembered something, especially if they have trouble talking about feelings or they're just not particularly, they don't process the world that way. Asking them to recall a place and tell you a story about a place will often lead them on their own to do a more reflective exercise.
I had a lyrical question. I was interested in how it felt to be the interviewee, and also how it felt to be either hearing your story presented to the audience by someone else, or presenting someone else's story to the audience. How did that?
How to be the interviewee, I felt stupid because I couldn't remember the first time I voted. So when she asked, I was like, I just didn't say anything for a few minutes. And I'm like, I really cannot remember the first time. I think I know, but I wasn't sure. So I thought, well, that's a good thing to remember though. If someone, especially if I have students or I'm interviewing someone, you may ask them a question that they're not sure about. Then they feel stupid because it's about their own life and they can't remember when they did it. So that's something to remember.
And also preparing your interviewee when you kind of are talking to them initially. Sometimes it helps, I think, to set, these are the types of questions I'm interested in asking. Of course, they always, as we've talked about, have the choice to answer or not or whatever, but sometimes if they have a little bit of time to think ahead of time, they're going to feel less on the spot or a little bit less like, oh gosh, I'm supposed to know this, but I don't,
Yeah.
It's okay to prepare them a little bit, So how else do people feel as being interviewees?
Something that I thought was important was the idea of the audience as well. I don't know Josh all that well. We just met yesterday really for the first time, but telling my story to him was a little different than having him present it to the rest of the audience. Just because there is that, at least some part of a personal relationship. So the importance of, telling your story to someone who you feel you have a connection with and then realizing it's going to be generalized to a broader audience.
That's a great transition to what JC was going to talk about.
I was going to add to that too, that I felt sort of self-conscious because I am just not a very politically oriented person, and so I would, if I knew that we're going to an audience, I would say something different.
I think that sense of vulnerability is important to remember. The vulnerability of the interviewee is very important to remember. Not that it stops us from doing this work, but that we're conscious of that, which is very much what JC is going to talk about. And then also that sense of responsibility when you're interpreting someone else's story for an audience, that kind of responsibility you have of doing it with integrity and carefulness is, it is a good.
One of the things that struck me during the interview and then following listening to this was, are there gendered responses? that would a man answer differently than a woman in general? Is there some sort of
Would a
you know,
man answer
subtext
differently if a
going
woman
on
was
here?
asking
Yeah.
than a woman would answer if a woman was asking?
Or would the memory of voting be more profound for some reason for one gender as opposed to another?
Well,
That because of gender expectations or something of that sort.
Right, when you're coming up with these types of questions, whether they're specific to a topic or the time period or to that person's life experience, those are the kinds of questions you want to ask yourself as you're preparing for the interview. How relevant may or may this topic be, and what is this person's life, what can this person tell me about their life experience, which is going to illuminate their perspective on it, you know, and then how does all that information fit into your larger research project is something that you can think a little bit about ahead of time, but also you don't want to let constrain you during the interview itself. So, yeah, speaking to kind of what happens when this lives on beyond that particular moment.
Right. So we have quite a bit of content about what happens after the interview, and I guess my approach is going to just be to give you some key highlights, and then we can open up for questions. So something that Seth was speaking about earlier was ways that you can engage with the interviewee afterwards, and how you're kind of really building a relationship with them, and you can keep the conversation going. And so something that we do, and that I encourage you all to do, is to send a thank you note to your interviewee, just to thank them for their time and you know, all the effort that went into participating in the interview, because it can be a lot. And something else that we do is we always send out the audio and the transcript to the interviewee after it's been processed, or after we finish recording it and whatnot. So sometimes we can send them the CD, and we can email the transcript, and so that helps them actually have the material that they helped to create, and then it also gives them a chance to help us edit the interview and to make sure that they're comfortable with what they said, and that also speaks to the restriction part. They can listen to it, they can decide, is this something that I'm comfortable having in the public, or do I want to edit pieces of it? So in the handbook that you all got, I included our transcribing guidelines. It's on, I think, page 30. And so when you're transcribing the interviews that you've done, obviously you can adhere to whatever format you think is best, and whatever resources you have available will factor into how you transcribe them. But I wanted to point out that one of the most basic things that we consider when we're transcribing and editing the transcripts is to keep it as close to the audio as possible. We don't do a lot of heavy editing. We have in the past kind of changed things around, but something that we're trying to do now is just keep it as close to the actual audio as possible. We don't edit for grammar. We try to make it really clear to the interviewees that the spoken word is different than the written word, and that's okay. There's no reason to pretend that this is going to be like a perfectly polished grammatical sentence, because it's not, and that's actually something really special about oral history. So we try not to fit that into a different kind of format, because it just doesn't really do it justice. And so the things that we do edit are mostly for clarity. If a sentence just really doesn't make sense, then we might change the grammar a little bit just to help clarify things for the researchers, but we don't spend a lot of time, correcting word order and whatnot.
What would you do if somebody was aware that their English was considered substandard and they wanted you to polish it?
Well, we do send them the transcripts, and they can do their own edits. So we give them that option, but we do try to, if they were very concerned about that, we would work with them to find something that made them comfortable, and we would certainly let them, we would include their edits, but we do try to explain to them from the outset that it doesn't have to sound, it's going to be spoken word, and it doesn't have to read perfectly. But you can certainly work with them to include their edits.
Can I just add? I think that the edited transcript, I think Winston Churchill would be disappointed in it, but I think someone who considers himself a substandard speaker would be pleased. That is to say, on the page, the drop G's are there. That is to say, if you're dropping your G's, you're not going to see your transcript back. The G's will be in the transcript. We're not trying to write dialect. The transcriber's not trying to write those kind of verbal slip-ups and ticks and the ums and the ahs that aren't part of the content of the interview, but are there because someone's having trouble formulating their thoughts. So someone who's used to speaking publicly might look at a transcript and say, wait a second, I'm much more eloquent than that. But I think somebody who is not used to speaking publicly and who speaks in a way that they, as you say, they might consider substandard would be pleased to see complete sentences there. And they might not see what they understand as substandard reflected back at them.
And I wonder what, there's an argument for the honesty of, somebody, I think of a relative of mine who I love dearly, but who didn't know the word doesn't exists. And, it would, in a sense, been a dishonest representation of this person to correct all of her down home.
Yeah, well, this is what we don't.
Doesn't.
This is.
But it's like he don't, she don't.
Yeah,
this is what we don't typically correct.
Okay.
Someone who would say,
so the flavor of the
don't instead of doesn't.
Speech, and if you,
Yeah, there's not going to be a word there that they didn't say. So if it says, you don't believe in, eating meat on Fridays, it's got to say you don't believe in eating meat on Fridays. Yeah.
But I have had experience with some interviewees who are horrified by the transcript and
these
embarrassed.
Are very well educated.
Well educated, who are horrified and embarrassed by the transcript and absolutely spend a lot of time editing it beyond where I'm comfortable with it, because I think it's not going to match what happens. If someone's listening to the audio and trying to follow along, these don't match, but she is so, she won't let it go into the archive the way it is, because she finds it too embarrassing. So,
And as a researcher, you then sort of have to say, okay,
right.
Because that future researchers will be able to listen to the audio, they will have the transcript, and that's just part of the process, is kind of combining these relationships, people's developing relationships with themselves and comfort levels with themselves.
Is there a note or something that you put on, a notation that says this has been edited by the interviewee, or do you just put a transcription and someone has to go listen to the audio to find out it's been heavily edited?
We don't actually indicate on the transcript that it's been. There are some cases where you can tell, like older ones, will have that notation, but at present we don't.
If there's been an external editor, that person is noted. Although I would have to disagree with the characterization of the interviews as being heavily edited. The interviews are edited to ensure the greatest degree of clarity and truthfulness as possible. If an interview gets to the point where someone is requesting a heavy edit, as Rachel was saying, then we have a conversation with them about whether or not that interview is worth including in the collection. Because it's not our job to be a marketing team for someone who wants to push a certain story or to reshape how the interview actually unfolded. And we mentioned very briefly earlier the question of, what's the actual interview? What is this thing? If we become uncomfortable with the idea that a transcript is not actually reflective of what took place in the interview, then we have to sit down and have a conversation about whether or not that transcript will go into the collection and become a public record, which is not just a record of history, but it's also a record of our work and a testament to our integrity. And so we need to make sure that those things align very carefully.
Right, when we talk about editing transcripts, we're not talking about changing content, we're not talking about changing around sentences or even adjusting words within sentences. We're talking about, correct me, because JC works with this the most closely, but taking out the excessive ums and ahs and you knows that I like and likes, that, any speaker would practice as they're kind of processing their thoughts verbally. And then sometimes adding commas, adding periods, I don't know that we add too many semicolons, for example, but those are the types of things just for clarity, just for the sake of the reader and then listener, also to the audio, knowing which concepts were being articulated through the course of the interview.
Sometimes someone will start a sentence several times before they finish the sentence, and sometimes we or they will take out the first one or two,
First one or two starts.
The false starts and things like that. Even the one woman I'm talking about, it's not like she was taking out whole segments or anything. She just wanted it to be smoother than it appeared.
One more thing I will add is we did experiment with absolute verbatim transcription for a run of about 50 interviews where we kept in every single like and you know and and ah to really see what it would be like to create as the words are hard to find true, as accurate, you know, a paper record that reflected as directly as possible what was actually spoken. And then I ran through one of those little word cloud things, you know, that generates the most common words, and it was a jumble of words, and right in the middle, in big letters, was and all around it was and ah, and like, and then it sort of was, you know, and then right when you got to the end, it was like, civil rights movement. So we changed that policy.
I mean, editing is not, it's not the same as editing written work. You know, you just have to kind of approach it from an ethical standpoint, from a theoretical standpoint, and a practical standpoint, just like you do the verbal exchange that you have with the person in the interview.
There's this interview that Nell Painter, and they was and the way it has been published is that there is the verbatim Southern Alabama 1930s language of this African-American Marxist activist, and then there's a cleaned up version that Nell Painter then transcribed for the consumption of 2015 college students. But they are side by side, and there's a very clear understanding that this is what Hosea Hudson said, and this is what Nell Painter rewrote for our consumption.
And that's it's a fascinating kind of window into what oral history does and does not do, and the ways in which it reveals history and the ways in which it also silences history. That's the kind of exciting project. We also work with people who do ethnopoetic transcriptions of oral histories. And that's another kind of taking this work to a creative level of interpretation that stimulates conversations in the field and also with the public. You know, unless you're, I think, working as an oral historian, or a historian like Nell Painter does, that's not the typical practice you would do with oral history. But it's important to think about, even if you're just doing interviews with your grandma, I think, because these things do live on, and how they live on is important.
One use that I've had for these, I have my students interview each other before they go out, but I find that helping them listen to themselves speaking has been really helpful, and then they can hear the likes and ums and I don't know and this maybe stupid buts in their conversation. And I teach at a women's college, so that's also something that later on they're more aware of when they're interviewing. So totally unrelated to oral history, but it's a way to help undergraduate students reflect on their self-presentation as well. So.
Well, that's one of the things we say when we teach about our teaching, is that it really enhances students' not just listening skills, but oral presentation skills, because they're acutely aware of how they use language.
So again, in the handbooks, it basically gives a list of like different things that we can take out. So the likes, the ums, the ahs, all of that. So you can refer to that, and then obviously at your own institution, you can enforce those or enforce your own and just be consistent with that. So I have release forms up there, but I think I'm going to skip ahead to archives, and I think we'll probably talk a lot about release forms. I think I want to give that enough time, give us enough time to really go into those. So quickly I'll talk about some of the archiving processes. So at present, I would highly recommend that you record digitally. There are a lot of different recorders out there, a lot of different price, there are some really good recorders that are very expensive. There are some still pretty good recorders that aren't as expensive. At present, we use Zoom H4n, and I think those are at a pretty reasonable price on Amazon. And I have a list of some of our the actual equipment that we use in the handbook as well, so you can take a look at that. And as far as the digital audio recording goes, we adhere to the archival standards that are basically enforced by the American Folklife Collection and the Library of Congress, which is to record as a WAV audio format. That's a type of format that doesn't lose bits over time, and if you transfer it from folder to folder or from your computer to someone else's computer, it won't lose the bits, whereas if you would record on an MP3, there's the chance that the audio could decay, the file could decay over time. So we definitely advise recording in WAV as your absolute archival copy that you keep, and you keep it well and you keep it for a long time. that said, we also recommend that you, if you're going to be using these interviews a lot, to make a copy as an MP3 that you can work with. And you can, so if you keep your wave in a safe place on your hard drive, or you can save it wherever. But if you're going to be doing a lot of things with these audio clips, the best thing to do is to make a copy as an MP3. And then you can work with it, you can manipulate it and use it however you want, but you don't risk losing the original audio format. So it's good to keep one copy that you're just kind of leaving alone as a preservation copy, and then one copy that is an access copy. And so that's what we do. We have the MP3s in our database where people can go and download them, but we keep the waves in like the permanent long-term archive. And so the other piece of that is recording or keeping a lot of copies is a better way to keep stuff safe. And saving them on multiple devices or on things like using cloud storage, that's also good practice. It can be really, really devastating to have, you know, you have this like 2-hour-long oral history, you think you have it saved, but then it turns out you deleted it somehow or it got lost somewhere in the mix. And so basically the more places you can save it, the better. So using something like Google Drive or Dropbox, those both give you a free limited amount of storage, and then you can also pay to have more storage, and they both run at pretty reasonable costs, and so that's a great place to save it safely. But again, you can also save it on multiple computers or on an external hard drive, just to be extra safe.
Hey Jason, can I add one thing I just thought of? And maybe you can evaluate this as someone who's an information professional. Probably the biggest storage space a lot of us have access to freely is our email.
Yeah.
Can we just email it and read to ourselves as a backup?
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, Google gives you a lot of storage if you have a Gmail account, but if you have a free Dropbox account, it's only like 10 gigabytes.
One of these files is like bigger.
You probably won't be able to email a WAV file to Gmail because there's usually a file size limit, but if you have a smaller file that you want to sort of keep, you have another layer of protection, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to email to yourself. Add a tag to it, and after you've done this 4 or 5 times, you've got a little library of metadata and files.
And a good way to remember this, in the archival community, there's a concept called locks. Lots of copies keeps stuff safe. That's just a really, there's an actual system that you can buy into, and it's like a software that you can pay for, but the concept also just goes beyond that. If you keep lots of copies, it'll be more safe. So lots of copies and on multiple devices, or as Seth suggested, like on your email, that's a good thing to do also. Another thing is naming the files. This seems like a fairly obvious thing to help just keep yourself organized, but unless you actually think of a system, you might find yourself being very inconsistent with this. So what you should do is come up with a file naming system that includes key pieces of information for your audio files and whatever other files you're producing, so like the transcript, if you're writing abstracts, if you have field notes. So what we do is we have the interviewee's last name, and then their first name, and then we have the interviewer's last name, and then the date. And you have all of that in the file name. And if you do that consistently, it helps have a really organized little library on your computer of the oral histories. And that's something that seems fairly common sense, but it can be hard to actually make yourself do it unless you come up with a system. And then beyond that, if you're doing lots of different projects, it's also a good idea to have some sort of folder library where you name like your projects with an intuitive title, and then you can put all the interviews from that project in there and all the other ones in the other file. So you can see on the screen how we have ours organized. We put numbers on our interviews, so that's what you see there. But it's just a good way to keep everything in one place, and then if you're searching through like 100 interviews, it's a lot easier to find than if you have them saved all over different places. The last thing that I wanted to mention was some of the documents that we create to go with our oral histories. So if you look in your handbook, the last, I think they start on, starting around page 16, I give you samples of some of the different materials that we produce to go along with them. And so you don't have to do these, but these are just things that we do that we find really helpful for ourselves and for the researchers who are coming to our collection. And the ones that I want to highlight are the abstract. So it's just, you know, a few days or like even the same day that you record the interview, it's really good to sit down, write down all the things that, that you talked about during the interview in chronological order. And then this helps you come up with like a short little paragraph that just describes the contents of the interview. It makes it really easy to look back on it later, and it also helps the researchers understand the context of the interview. And then if you are actually going to be depositing your interview in an archive, this is an excellent thing to have so that outside researchers can look quickly, they can see the keywords that they're interested in. So it's really helpful for everyone in the process. And field notes are another thing that we do. And field notes are basically, after the interviews, just sitting down and writing down like what you remembered, how you felt during the interview, with a focus on the things that you can't pick up just from listening to the audio alone or reading the transcript alone. A lot of times things will happen, like somebody might have some sort of body language that the audio just can't pick up, but it seemed really important, and so that's the place that you can write that sort of thing down. Or if there's an interruption or some like crazy noise that's going on in the background, the field notes are another place to just kind of explain like this is what was going on. So that's really helpful for you as if you do a lot of interviews and you're trying to think back like what was a special thing about that interview, your field notes will capture that for you, and then researchers in the future can look at that as well to pick up things that they wouldn't be able to know just from listening to the audio. So now we can get back to release forms.
Can I just add quickly one thing to that? Is that speaking as someone who started doing oral history not in a program like SOHB, at the time I would have thought, oh, well, all that paperwork, it's not like I have too much to work with in terms of audio material, I'll just figure out a way to keep track of it. Well, years and years later, I look back on it and I wish I had taken the time to establish a system that would work for myself so that I could have later, say, transfer the materials with the interviewee's consent to an archive that would then make sense, in a way that would make sense. Because I didn't take that time early on as I was working by myself, my stuff is a mess, and now 20 years later, I don't really remember. So ultimately this great material is of limited usefulness, but these are the types of things that are just intended to help you kind of think about organizing your work ahead of time, again, before, during, and after, so that these materials can have the longest life possible. And you can decide, you have options later on down the road if you decide to do different things with them.
Do you worry about the tape log?
Yeah, sure. So sometimes we use tape logs if we aren't able to transcribe the full interview, just depending on what the project is. So tape logs are basically just every time a topic changes in the interview, you write down a few sentences, mark the timestamp in the document, and then you just do that. So it's just like a few sentences about each topic that changes like every 5 minutes or so. So it's a really good thing to do if you don't have the means to transcribe a huge body of interviews. You can still carefully go back and know what you're talking about.
Question about, is there any protocol for recording interviews that are done over the phone? I mean, I know that's not like most desirable, but sometimes that's the only option.
I've done them that way before, but I've always sort of just tried to do the exact same paperwork and note it in the field notes, maybe describe why the circumstances for the phone call were necessary, if that seems important to the research project overall. There can be audio issues, of course, with the phone. There can be, people are doing stuff on Skype now, which I find very confusing, but Seth's nodding like he knows what the...
Well, I think the easiest way to do it would be using Skype. Are you familiar with Skype?
Oh, I am.
Yeah.
The person like someone I'm interviewing might not be
And
on Skype.
that's the catch, yeah. I suppose if you're going to have to take the leap to ask them to use technology of some kind to record, maybe you can get on the phone with them and help them install it.
The Skype project don't record. Do you record through Skype, or are you setting up an external camera? What do you do when
You can record through Skype directly onto your computer. And if you google how to record through Skype, I just did. I'm looking at a page called How to Record a Skype Call. So that's out there. The question of how to get the person on the other end using the technology too is not easy. Although it's certainly not one that hasn't been considered. So I'll do some digging and maybe there's someone out there who's answered that question.
As it relates specifically to oral history.
For those of you working with students, a lot of them have iPhones, and those actually record quite well. If you're just using it for teaching, and that they're going to be using it for their classroom, and you're not donating it or whatever. often don't have to go out and buy recorders because they all have these things that they carry around.
I also use my iPhone as the backup recorder. So I use the Zoom recorder as like the primary copy, but just in case something happens, because we've all heard horror stories where you accidentally delete the interview during the interview or something crazy happens. So having an extra recorder, just like an iPhone, would be something I recommend.
Do you use the audio part, the recording part of that on the iPhone?
Yeah.
And you can get that off the iPhone?
Yeah, it's like, I think the voice memo,
Yeah.
there's like an app, I'm not sure, it's like an app, the voice memo app, that I think just comes on all iPhones. And
You can't get it off, it's a complicated iTunes thing.
Just sync it with iTunes.
Yeah, it's.
Yeah,
you have
I just
to- you
get
have to
trouble
put,
getting it off.
You can put iTunes on your computer, and then it pulls up the voice memos as like music. It's really irritating.
I'll just do it.
Yeah, I would think that, and when you're working that way, that adds another layer to the file naming process and the file storage process, that you just, again, want to take a few minutes to think about, as you're planning for.
The tip blocks mean that you will say, or you're recording your field notes at minute 3.15 the subject so that you can find it quickly. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And again, all these tips are basically just things that I have found that work well and that work well with the SOHP. But if you're planning to donate your materials, or if you already have a relationship with an archive or with some local historical society, talk to them. I'm sure that they have their own guidelines and practices that will help you, and they're probably very happy to help you along with that too. And then if you are donating, talking to them early about what they expect just makes the donating process a lot easier. We recently had somebody who wanted to donate a bunch of mini discs, and the interviews on them are excellent, but it's a difficult thing that you have to sit down with each mini disc and play the entire thing, and then I'm having a student convert it to MP3. So you just want to think about things like that before you get into the project, because it can be time consuming, and if you know at the outset what you should be doing, it saves a lot of time. And so similarly, if you're working with some sort of institution, they probably have their own policies about how to gather the deeds of gift, or how to gather the release forms, and what their expectations are in terms of ownership and who can access what and who can use what. So in the handbook, I have examples of some of our different deed of gift forms with, I think it starts on page 12. So like I was saying earlier, we do offer restrictions, and I would encourage you to do the same. I'm sure that you all have those options. And so we try to have like a concise list of restrictions that people can choose to enforce. It used to be kind of like on a per interview basis, people would say like, oh, I want my interview to be restricted in this way for this amount of time. But it's important that you're actually able to enforce those within, like reasonably. And so we've been finding that if we give them like a limited list of options, something will work for them. If something doesn't work, we can work with them further to make them comfortable. But so I would recommend just establishing what you think reasonable restrictions would be on the interviews, instead of just letting them come up with them on their own, so that you can actually handle the oral histories the best, and that you can actually provide access at a reasonable time.
Because you have to track, as they put these restrictions on, you have to be able to then go determine if somebody requests to see the interview or listen, or if there's something that comes in that might violate the restriction, you have to have an easy way to determine the answer to that person's question, whether this is a violation of the restriction or not. And so by offering a series of sort of standard, semi-standard restrictions, it means that you're not keeping track of, how many interviews might be closed for 7 years versus 5 years versus 12 years versus, life of the interviewee, etc. There's sort of a way to categorize and track that kind of information so that you can honor the interviewee's request in the easiest way.
Mm-hmm. So page 15 is our example of a restriction form that we're currently using. And you can see that we just give them a predetermined amount of time to close the interview. Yep.
I see in the deed of gift, one of the last lines you say is, I understand that you may not be able to uphold these restrictions against the freedom of information request or subpoena. If it's going to be deposited with a public institution like the university, most of which have, if they're state supported, they probably have to honor pretty much every freedom of information request. Is there some way to structure this that limits the amount of freedom? I mean, it has to be a reasonable freedom of information request. It can't just be, gee, let me see everything on Joe Brown.
Yeah, this is when I think we ask our institutional review board and university attorneys and the people that are in charge of intellectual property concerns at our institution what kind of leeway we can have. You know, Seth has done a lot of creative work with Creative Commons licenses also, which are, another kind of standard practice that offers various different avenues to preservation and access. But again, I think we're bound by what UNC's policies are. And we also don't expect ourselves to have complete mastery, of all of that material. So this is also part of the project planning and execution process, is to kind of have that number of the university attorney that you can call and ask questions to. And you had also had a specific question about the IRB earlier that, these deeds of gifts are written in consultation with all of us, going back to the collaborative piece of this. We all work on them. We work on them with, members, alumni of the program, people who have been through a variety of experiences and situations with oral histories. We write them in consultation with people in other faculty and other departments that are doing oral history. And then, of course, the library is absolutely key because they have policies and procedures around accepting and preserving materials. And the IRB is kind of our institutional review board, is kind of our gateway, I guess I would say. They're kind of, or at least I'm losing my metaphor right now, but don't transcribe this, it'll look like a mess. But the IRB is sort of our gateway to these other questions that are external to our specific responsibilities as researchers. And so whether you're a program that's submitting a project for IRB approval, or you're an individual that's submitting a project for IRB approval, we've always approached the IRB as this is a consultation process. They can dictate to us certain things, but then we're the researchers, and we are the ones who are in closest touch with the community members that are sharing their stories. So we have a lot of knowledge to bring to that table too. And if the IRB, which of course is designed for a very different type of human subject research than oral history, if the IRB is imposing restrictions on our work that we don't feel is, legitimate, we push back, and that's a negotiation process that is solely dependent on your own university's kind of practices and procedures.
So for instance, at my institution, it's a very small institution, very new institution. Lawyers seem to get involved in every drop of the hat. They don't want anything done. They don't like research because you might be sued for it.
Yeah.
And they think of oral history as ethnography.
And they do have an institutional review board?
There's an IRB. It's run by, at least in my school, it's run by the sociologists and the psychologists. And then we have consultation with some of the people in biology and folks like that. But mostly in ours, it's social psych, and they want a transcript. If you have a transcript, I want first a script of what you're going to ask, and it needs to be the same thing that's asked every time.
Yeah, we're required to do that too. It doesn't actually happen that way, of course, because we're historians. we're not doing surveys when we ask these questions. We're not doing participant surveys, and we're not ethnographers, as similar as some of this work is to ethnography. It's not ethnography, and it's not journalism. And we have to fulfill the requirements that they set out for us, but then in practice, all we can do is best steward our relationships with the interviewees. And, for example, we recently had a project that none of us supervised, but another faculty member partner of ours had interviewed someone who, when they were interviewed, their legal status in the United States was not particularly secure. Since then, their legal status has become more secure, and they have moved to a different place in their life, and they want their interview removed from the collection completely. And we had kind of a debate about, like, well, is that a good precedent to set? You know, and the person was claiming that they didn't understand that it would be, you know, put in a publicly available archive and that kind of thing. And so what we did was we asked the PI, the principal investigator, to talk with that individual and determine kind of the story of what happened as this person changed their mind. Was it really that they didn't understand? And if they didn't really understand, that's kind of an, you know, as I would look at an IRB issue. I mean, it's a violation of the faith that is put in us when we receive approval from the IRB. But if they did understand and they changed their minds, that's not an IRB violation. That's like life, basically. And then we can be flexible and adjust when we took the interview out of the archive. Although typically, again, we would just try to ask questions of everybody involved and not expect the IRB to really be able to identify with what oral history practice is.
Do you have to run a new IRB every time you come up with a new, say you're doing a class and doing oral history is a part of a class. It's not an oral history class, it's maybe sub-history or something like that. And you teach it once every 2 years.
You'd have to ask your university. You'd have to ask your own.
I would also just recommend that, Cliff Kuhn was in here earlier, the Oral History Association website has a lot of great resources, a lot of great, people talk about these issues and all of these kinds of, so it's a great, that's a really good website to go to if you have these kinds of questions for resources to look at.
And if you need to have a conversation with an attorney at your university, going to that website first would be a great idea.
There are also some strategic ways in which you can fulfill the obligation in an honest and straightforward way, but also in a way that doesn't unduly burden you to do paperwork instead of doing your research. We have to renew our IRBs, and if you can conceive of a large project that includes student interviewers that's broad enough that it could fulfill the terms of the IRB every 2 years, you might end up just doing you're doing an interview on civil rights, turn an IRB for a broad civil rights community-based oral history project, and you only do the interviewing every couple of years with your students, but that might be an opportunity for you to renew an existing IRB instead of having to turn a whole new one in. At our institution, there are also exceptions for using oral histories or using human subjects research in order to do training rather than research. So if your goal is to familiarize your students with the practices of oral history, it might be, if your university has a similar exception, it might fall under the category of training instead of human subjects research. One good thing about
So how did you get that?
No, I didn't get it. I just read it in the small text on some document. But if
you could request it as an IRB to have that?
At UNC, if you are doing, to the best of my knowledge, if you are doing research that is, if you are doing work with human subjects that is about training rather than research, don't ask me to define the difference between those two things. You are not required to file an IRB for that particular.
You're not required to file?
Right.
At UNC.
At UNC.
So I don't know the legal difference between those two terms. I don't know. Everything that I have done when I have evaluated my own projects has seemed to be very obviously about human subjects research, and I have not sought to exempt myself with the training. But those kinds of distinctions might exist at your institution. It might allow you to do work with students if they're just going to do one interview in order to familiarize themselves with methods that could work. One useful thing that the IRB does is to force you to confront questions like Dalila asked earlier about, what do you do when, as an oral historian, you are actually in a position where you might harm a subject? I mean, that's what the IRB is there for, to protect people against harm. And it's supposed to be about people who are, receiving injections of drugs to test for something, and doesn't ever quite feel like the oral historian quite has the power that to do something quite that dramatic. That said, I don't mean to laugh at the possibility that uncovering a traumatic memory could be a very serious event for somebody, and that can have a long-term emotional impact on them. And so one thing the IRB does do is requires you to put down in writing how you will respond to certain scenarios of harm.
And so it can be a very helpful process to go through because of that.
So even if you don't do an IRB, I think it's a good idea to think about the different kinds of things you might ask people that might provoke a difficult response and the different kinds of responses you can provide to their response, which often comes down to making sure they understand that they can stop the interview at any point, that they have power over the final record that comes out of the interview, and that you will respect their wishes as far as it comes to the disclosure of personal information. And in the past, for all of our projects, we've had to say, what potential harm is there, and how will you address it? And I think it's good to have that kind of in writing, even if it's just in your personal files as a reflection of the fact that you thought about it. So, I find that the IRBs just, really onerous, and they don't always seem relevant. But that particular element of it, I think, is worthwhile. And then, of course, I try to sort of spin it in my own mind by saying, this is me being protected by this behemoth of a university that will come, intervene on my behalf.
Yeah, I was going to say, the attorney could wind up being your friend in various cases. And so what you're doing by engaging in this process is giving that attorney whose client, you may be their client, evidence to uphold your integrity, to make your case as a researcher, and also by extension to make the university's case, not just to protect, as a way of protecting the research, also as a way of protecting the subject, and then as a way of protecting you, the researcher, so it's good to have thought about all these things. And but I wouldn't take, attorneys also, like you said, love to say no to everything, and I just wouldn't take no. The Oral History Association website has got a lot of things on there to give you the language with which to say, but,
Yeah, and in addition to the Oral History Association resources, I'd also recommend a book by John Neuenschwander called Oral History and the Law. A lot of you are probably familiar with it, but that's kind of like the basic text that goes over a lot of these questions that we all have, and so it's a great resource to refer to, and then you can figure out how to apply it to your own situation based on what he recommends. And so something that we've been touching on a lot has been some of the language that you want to be using, so specifically in IRBs, but it also should be going in your consent form, and something that you need to make sure that everybody is just aware of before going into the interview, and that you actually have in writing is, like, what is the goal of your project? What are you trying to achieve? What is the scope of your project? And then what are you planning on doing with the interviews? And something that we've, in recent years, been working on trying to make more clear in our release forms is that we have an online archive, like a searchable database of our interviews. And so after the interview has been conducted and processed, it goes into this database. So that means it is available online. And so what does that actually mean for each interview? And for some people, they understand that if you Google their name, it might come up. Some people don't understand that. And so we have to, it's important for you to explain that and to very carefully explain on your consent forms what each piece of this actually means, how the material could be accessed, how it could be used. So you can look on page 14 at one of our sample consent forms. And this particular sample is something that we've been, Seth actually introduced with one of his projects, and it uses a Creative Commons license. So in the past, our policy was that the interviewer would sign over, with the deed of gift, the contents of their interviews. So that includes the physical materials, like the tape, the transcript. But now that things are going digital, it's a little bit more tricky, who actually owns this stuff. You can have multiple copies, like Seth was saying earlier. And so we've been finding that we don't necessarily think it's the best thing to do to say, we own this material, thanks for giving it to us, and now it's ours. So with this license, it actually lets you, they can retain the copyright, they can use the materials since we view them as a co-creator. But with this license, it lets both the interviewee and the interviewer, and then whatever body they're depositing with, you can use it in multiple ways. And so this gives everyone a lot more flexibility. It helps share the ownership so that it's not just the oral history, the repository where it's existing. Everyone can have it. It's not just the repositories.
Also, we've had at least 2 interviewees recently who have consented to an interview only after being shown this form that they were not comfortable with consenting to before because they were concerned about ownership over their stuff, over their memories.
So we have about 15 minutes left, and we're just really grateful that y'all hung in here with us. I think the best thing to do is just to have, more questions and, comments that you all have or experiences you want to share for the last period of time we have. Yes?
I've noticed on page 26 you have a sample transcript of appears to be a married couple. And I know you're using it as a sample of a transcript, but my question is, because I've been faced with this a number of occasions, is when you have couples, if you can, should you interview them individually, say they're involved in a movement or event, to get more information and different perspectives? Or do you find it equally valid to do to interview them both at the same time? When I look at this transcript, it looks like you start off with the husband and his background, and then 2 pages in, the interviewer starts asking the wife about her early years. And then as time goes on, it appears that the husband is jumping in and answering the wife's questions. And then you have the end of the sample interview, so we don't know if she's recovered to tell her story. I mean, do you have some thoughts about interviewing couples? And if you must interview them as a couple, the best way to go about it? Have one tell their story until they meet, have the other tell their story till they meet, and then what input do you have here? Thank you.
I think part of it depends on what you're interested in. So, if I were interviewing somebody about the impact of the feminist movement on their life, I probably wouldn't want the husband in the room. I mean, you could do it, but you're going to get a very different story. But if it's really about this couple's participation in the civil rights movement or something, then sometimes what emerges is interesting in the dynamic between the two of them, and sometimes they help each other remember things that one or the, and what emerges is this kind of, especially, who's the couple from Highlander, and he couldn't really.
Oh yeah, we did an interview with a guy named Kenny Caroline at Highlander, and he had a huge influence on the movement at Highlander, but his memories were fading, and he was unwell, and so it was helpful to him to have his wife next to him. He didn't really answer a lot of questions, but he did make some effort to, and her being there, I mean, that adds a whole another dynamic, was she coaching him? Is that coaching appropriate or not? I mean, all these questions are out there. But yeah, so there are instances when you're getting the interview only because the people are agreed to be interviewed together.
I think sometimes people they'll only do it. There have been cases where they'll only do it if they can do it together. They're just not comfortable with it otherwise. But I agree that it's probably better in most cases to do it separately. And B, if you're doing it together, you just have that intense listening. You're doing it, you've added a whole nother level to that, and you have to really be listening for both. And is she getting talked over, or is he, is she coaching him? So it does complicate it, but if their relationship is part of what you're interested in, stuff will emerge from that interview.
And if you look at the practice of interviewing as relationship building, you have a couple of different options over time. That you can start out interviewing them together if they just seem to only want to do it that way. You can then, after they're comfortable, go back and say, I'd like to interview you separately. There's ways that you can change the topics around during the interview and in subsequent interviews. So, for us, I think this works the best when you're not just focused on the one-shot interview, but also that it's something that can really kind of evolve over time.
And just make sure that you have the both signed release form.
The release form. Yeah. Yes.
Do you do audit edits? Do you actually listen to the tape and before you give it to the narrator?
Yeah.
You do.
Most of the time. I mean, I don't,
Who does it, the interviewer or
the
somebody else?
interviewer,
Interviewer, occasionally some of our grad students will do it for.
an undergraduate, or, yeah, I mean, you know, there's, again, we're collaborating, so say Seth and I are working on a project and Seth just needs me to vet the interview for whatever reason. As long as I'm familiar enough, you know, with the context for that particular discussion and what the goals are of the research project, I think somebody else could conceivably do it, but it really needs to be somebody who's very closely affiliated with the research.
And who does the transcribing?
We hire folks.
We hire somebody.
Yeah, and there's some numbers in your packet about just roughly estimating costs for that kind of thing. Of course, again, when I started out doing this by myself, I was transcribing. I didn't know to do tape logs. That would have been really smart. But, you know, I would sit there and then I would like burn out after 4 hours and, you know, 30 minutes of this person talking. So there's, you know, depending on your resource level, there's ways to kind of to master the material of the interview in a quicker fashion. And so then transcribing the whole thing and doing a tape log, then transcribing parts of it. You know, there's just a variety of ways to access that information.
The transcription too is kind of a personal thing in a way. I think we're in the middle of two poles as an organization who represents ourselves, you know, to a college that sort of needs to devote state money, dwindling state money, to supporting us. We need to say, well, we have this number of interviews in the collection, we brought them in, we archived them. So we're an archival shop that needs to generate interviews as a product. But we're also historians trying to do work with human subjects on subjects that we're interested in research plans that we've designed. I think I've talked to individual scholars who have said, I would never hire someone else to transcribe my interview. Are you kidding me? Like, I want to listen to it. I want to transcribe it myself. I want to listen to it more than once. This is part of me learning about my subject. So that's on sort of one pole. And then the other pole is, you know, someone who's collecting. And then, of course, all in the middle of the spectrum are people, many of whom are perhaps in this room, who need to get the paper done or the book done on a timeline and need help with transcription. Or people who won't transcribe at all or only transcribe portions of it. So all that is just to say that I know that there are people who really believe that transcription should be something that they do themselves as oral historians. And then there are people who believe in building an archive so others can use that material as quickly as possible.
So, I'm sorry, there's somebody right behind you.
Just real quick, this might be a really stupid, basic question, but when you talk about oral history, does that also include if you videotape the interview? Okay, because do you transcribe and save it as the videotape, or you just save the oral part?
You mean when we're storing it?
Yes.
We store the video.
You store the video, okay.
Yeah, we don't separate the audio track. We store the video, and this is something that, you know, Seth just completed this massive project with the Smithsonian, where they wanted all of these oral histories videotaped. Mm-hmm. And I mean, the storage problem is not insignificant, but
yeah,
it's
they're like
also
600 gigabytes each minimum.
yeah. You know, but it's also obviously it adds a whole other layer of engagement with the material and with the past when you have video. So.
And that's more of a follow-up to that. Is your recommendation if you do that the video is if you're filming always the person being interviewed, and that the interviewer is not in the frame in the picture?
That's a good question. So we've been doing recording lately because there's only one person in the room with the camera. You know, in my experience, I put the camera right here, and I said, don't worry about the camera, let's just talk. And I said an audio recorder too, because I'm paranoid about the camera.
Okay, yeah.
And so the camera's just been a frame of that person talking. But that's a kind of workman-like way of just getting the image on the screen, and it doesn't take into account documentary methods, I think, or other
Yeah, so my background is documentary film, and whenever I think about doing oral history on video, I usually have some kind of project in mind that puts this in the context of a larger story that's told through film on screen. And so we don't have time today, but another workshop at another point would delve into all of SOHP's work in kind of a public-facing way, dealing with how to disseminate this material in a variety of forms. And so but that is another thing you want to think about when you're planning the project, kind of especially with video, what other purposes could this be for? Is the interviewee comfortable with that? Am I the researcher comfortable with that? And what am I then trying to capture visually that is really going to, in some substantive way, add to the audio? Because there's almost no, I mean, at least from my purpose, from my perspective of limited resources, you know, there's no point in hiring a videographer to shoot an interview if seeing the person is not going to really add much to the audio. You know, if you are going to spend that kind of money, you may want to get other things about their environment. You know, you may want to get them in relationship or dialogue with someone else. The Smithsonian really wanted everything to be on video, and that works for them, but for me as a documentary filmmaker, I'm kind of thinking, well, you know, I don't just want everything simply to be on video because video exists. If that makes sense. Did you have a question? And then
my question was transcription software, driving natural speed, things like that. They don't work that well, do they? Yeah.
Yes, they do.
Not in my experience, but
no, really?
if you had, we need to talk if you've had a different experience.
I've had great experience with it,
Okay.
but I'm not doing huge projects. In fact, that's what I was going to say. I said, especially with 12.1, I've had, you know, really good experience. But you have to be very focused, because what I do is I've done the interview, and what I do, it's strictly for transcription. I put the microphone near the recorder, but then I'm watching my screen as it goes along, because, you know, one of the great ones was in an older version, the word was housewives and it came out as houseflies. So, which, you know, but you have to be vigilant as you're listening and watching to see it go from, you know, the recorder to the written word. So
I guess saves you some time.
I'm sorry?
Which I guess saves some time,
It
but it's still very
does,
time
it does,
consuming.
because I'm very, you know, I want to do my own transcription.
well,
But,
I think, yeah, there's also a very personal preference thing.
well, it is, and if you're doing a huge project, I don't see where, but you know, I do little itty bitty ones, so for me, it works well.
The software says it doesn't usually work with two voices. You know, if you have
And that's also can be a problem.
Well, yeah, but I have
it
separate.
gets confused over.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
we
you
found
have to train it.
We found that Dragon works really well if you also feed it a transcript so it knows what it's reading.
Right.
That is to say, it can interact with something that's already been kind of transcribed in order to put other information in, but we haven't had a lot of success with getting good transcripts, public-facing transcripts out of voice recognition.
So,
My question is about the interview process and sort of between the two. So you're talking about it being a conversation, you're building relationships, really a connection. Not having done interviews, one of my places of anxiety is in one-on-one conversation, the way I am sort of socially trained to build connection is to share my own stories. And you know, and so in interviewing, I don't want to just sit there and go, or it doesn't quite feel right. Like, it doesn't feel like I'm making a connection. So I can't figure out. I feel like I need a few cues or things for myself to be able to say that I feel like I'm there and listening without getting drawn into, you know,
well, JC, why don't you speak to that, because you've been doing this more recently.
I think even if you say something like, wow, that's so interesting, like, that can be a lot. I think, like, eye contact, nodding, I am a big nodder, I guess, but things like that make them realize that you're listening. I think if you want to give, like, a really short aside, kind of like, I had this similar experience doing this, and then, like, wait, tell me more about your experience with that. I think you can throw in, like, little pieces that show how you relate to them, but if you try to, like, just keep it, like, make yourself keep it short, I think that works.
And don't underestimate the relationship building you can do outside of the interview. So you talked to this person before just to set the interview up and introduce yourself and told them maybe a little bit about your background and what you're interested in, and they might start talking to you on the phone. And you say, wait just say this. And you get there and they might make you a cup of coffee and you might chat. So there may be a lot of opportunities for you to do all that before the recorder's turned on. And a lot of times what I'll find is, you'll go in and you'll just listen and you don't really say a word about yourself, other than try to sort of convey that you're actively listening and absorbing the material. And then, as the interview's kind of winding down, things loosen up a little bit and you realize that you're quite comfortable sharing information, and then you kind of close things off nicely in a more kind of mutual way.
But also, I don't underestimate how powerful it is for somebody to have someone really listening to them. And that is so rare in our lives, that someone will sit and listen to you for an hour and a half or 2 hours. They usually, I think, that's a very powerful statement of your engagement and your, you know, and that they really value that. And it's a different experience than if you kept sort of saying, oh, I had that same experience. Well, you know, you don't really want to do that, because this is really about them, and you are demonstrating your connection to them through the listening and the asking of the follow-up questions. That's where you show that you're really paying attention and you're really thinking about what they're saying. And for most people, that's a really powerful experience, to have someone listen to them in that way.
And I would say, don't be too hard on yourself either about not getting it right the first time.
Yeah.
Like for me, having interviewed a whole lot of people who are members of my own community, I would have that same thing about like, people asking me questions, personal questions, really about like, who's my family? Now, didn't such and such happen to your daddy or granddaddy, or what was that in 1918 about blah, blah, blah. And in the early stages, I would find myself, in a conversation that was important for the relationship building. You know, I realized later probably could have happened earlier before I turned on the recorder, if I had sort of thought a little bit ahead of time about what kind of things this person might want to know about me, you know, or my engagement with this topic, for example. But then eventually, especially as I got more comfortable with being uncomfortable, if I felt like the impulse to tell a story of my own, I would be just like, quiet, Malinda. I would just not say anything. Or I would try to go to, wow, that's really interesting. And, you know, and just force myself to be quiet. You know, and then again, but it's just a process that none of us are really perfect at.
And once the recorder's off, you can say,
you know, or you know, the other thing is too, is like if none of that is really working and you just feel like this person needs you to share, you can cut the recorder off while you're sharing and turn it back on. And, you know, again, it makes for a difficult interview, I think, if you're doing that a whole lot. But again, maybe that's a practice run and you go back and you try to get a more sort of thorough retelling the next time. Yes.
Hi, so I was learned a lot, so thank you so much. Thank you so much. So I came here with the intention of learning how to go back home and interview tropical medicine physicians who spent 10 years, whatever, in African colonies doing tropical medicine. And there's this couple, so the question about the couple is very useful as well. So I was thinking that I probably was going to have to interview them for like 10 days. But because they spent X amount of years, you know, in this colony and in that colony. But I'm thinking that what I'm hearing is that that is not necessarily the case, right? That I just interview them in one sitting, that I have 10 really good questions or something like that. And then I really don't have to be
I think
for a good long time.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think part of what you're describing is the difference between folklore or folklore style ethnography and oral history. So like the little Mississippi trip I just described, for me, not being a folklorist or a trained ethnographer, but having, you know, anyway, read a lot of that stuff, you know, I figured that this would be much more of a relationship building type of trip, so that what I needed to do was not bring out the tape recorder at every opportunity that somebody said something important, but try to just really pay very, very close attention and be as authentic of a human being as I can in that relationship, right? So they get to know me, and so that the trust develops. And if one of your options is to go interview them for 10 days, like, first of all, that's going to just be exhausting. You're not going to know what to do with the material after it's over. But if you have enough time to, and these are not people you already have a personal relationship, well, that's good. You know, so they know you and they know where you're coming from. And what I have found, at least about my just really armchair folklore ethnographic practice, is that that's the key to helping them focus on the material that only they can give you in an oral history sense. So there's perhaps a sense at which you can explain to them before you go, we already have this relationship. I'm trying to get material that only you can share about this topic. And so we need to really think about chunks of time that you'll spend, or numbers of questions that you would ask, or certain topics that you would cover. And there might be, more than one interview that takes place, but in terms of kind of sitting down with them and just letting it go, it's not something that I don't think you or them is going to feel the type of transformative experience that we've been talking about around interviewing.
And there are other models, like the phenomenological interviewing, like where you, there's this other model of interviewing where the first, 2-hour interview is the sort of narrative piece, like what happened, or how did you get to this place? And then the next 2-hour interview, a couple days or months or weeks or whatever later, is what was the experience like of that thing that I'm most interested in? And then there's a whole other interview that's reflecting back on, like let's say it's about becoming a teacher. You spend 2 hours talking about your early life and all of that, 2 hours talking about the experience of being a teacher or becoming a teacher, and then 2 hours later reflecting back on that experience. So there are other models that could be useful in that setting.
But a lot of it, again, depends on your resources, how big of a collection are you trying to build around this particular topic. So those are all decisions that you all can make as researchers. Is there one more question? I know everybody's like starving and like, you see it. Well, thank you again.